Live broadcast of the afternoon session morning session, we saw the draft value-added tax bill passed with amendment. The bill was approved and passed after intense debate. And for this afternoon session, we anticipate that the Public Finance Management Amendment will come for first reading. The Land and House Tax Amendment will come for first reading. The Financial Services Regulatory Authority Amendment, the Insurance Amendment, and the International Business Companies Amendment. The value-added tax is to provide that it is provided that the Minister of Finance, by order published in the Gazette, amended the Schedule 2. Whereas it is further provided that under Section 1092 that the Act, that an order be made pursuant to Section 109. Oh, well, the session is about to commence. The Sergeant of Arms in
Good afternoon, members. When the House was suspended, we had just concluded the motion for the value-added tax resolution. Bills, Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to present the first reading of the bill shortly entitled Public Finance Management Amendment.
Public Finance Management Amendment.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move for suspension of Standing Order number 48-2 to allow the bill to go through its remaining stages at this sitting.
Honourable members, the question is that Standing Order 48-2 be suspended in order to allow the Prime Minister to proceed with the remaining stages of the bill at this sitting. And now put the question, as many as of that opinion say aye. As many as of a contrary opinion say no. I think the ayes have it. Ayes have it. Leave is granted. Please proceed, Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to present for second reading the bill shortly entitled Public Finance Management Amendments. Mr. Speaker, during the preparation of the budget, we found that there were certain sections of the Public Finance Management Bill that did not align to the Constitution of St. Lucia. The Constitution of St. Lucia, under Section 79(2), speaks to, Section 79 speaks to 30 days after the fiscal year 30 days after the fiscal year to present sections under 79(1), Mr. Speaker. It reads, the Minister for the time being responsible for finance shall cause to be prepared and laid before the House before or not later than 30 days after the commencement of each financial year estimates of the revenue expenditure of St. Lucia for that financial year. That was the Constitution of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, in the Public Finance Management Bill, it contravened the Constitution, and it read as follows. And on the second 32(1), for the purpose of section 79(1) of the Constitution of St. Lucia, Cap 101, the Minister shall no less than 30 days before the end of each financial year lay estimates before Parliament. Mr. Speaker, so these two sections contravened each other. In fact, Mr. Speaker, over the last 2 years, we found it very difficult to follow that prescription. Last year, the Minister of Finance came to Parliament to ask for an extension of time, ostensibly for the same reasons: COVID, staff shortages, staff not being able to, after somebody is tested for COVID, they have to take 7 days or 10 days off. So, and in spite of the hard work of the staff of the Ministry of Finance, it was not possible to follow that rule. And furthermore, the Constitution, Mr. Speaker, allowed 30 days after the end of the financial year. So it was decided, Mr. Speaker, to amend some of the sections of this bill, ostensibly amending section 32(1) to allow the Minister of Finance to lay the estimates of revenue expenditure before the House of Assembly no later than 30 days after the commencement of each financial year, as opposed to no later than 30 days before the end of each financial year. That is to align itself with the Constitution, because that's what the Constitution says on the 79(1), Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we also asked in this House to approve the amendment of section 32(3) of the Act to allow the House of Assembly to approve the appropriation bill no later than 30 days after laying of the estimates before the House of Assembly, as opposed to no later than the last day of each financial year. Again, aligning with the Constitution, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, by virtue of clause 3 of the bill, section 32(5) of the Act is amended so that the House of Assembly approve the appropriation bill no later than 30 days after laying of the estimates before the House of Assembly, where an extension of time is approved by the House of Assembly under section 32(4) of the Act, Mr. Speaker. So again, prescribes 30 days after, not more than 30 days after, even if there are provisions in the Constitution where you can spend up to 4 months after the end of the financial year, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, amending section 32(6) of the Act is amended by clause 3 of the bill to remove the condition that an emergency under section 17 of the Constitution of Lucia should exist before the Minister of Finance can authorize a provisional warrant. And clause 3, Mr. Speaker, of the bill also amends section 32(6) of the Act to correct the reference being made to the responsible minister with the minister, which means the minister is the Minister for Finance, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, in clause 4 of the bill, section 40 of the Act, provisional warrant is amended similarly to section 32(6) of the Act by removing the reference to an emergency under section 17 of the Constitution of St. Lucia, Cap 101. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the Act is amended under clause 5 of the bill to change the references made throughout the Act to Parliament with the House of Assembly. What that means, Mr. Speaker, is that money bills only have to come to the House of Assembly and not necessarily to the Parliament, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, these amendments will bring the bill in line with the Constitution, Mr. Speaker, and it actually came into force because the staff of the Ministry of Finance, in spite of the work that they had been doing, they found it was impossible to follow the the dictates of the PFM, even if they tried by their best efforts. So the recommendation came to extend it, and since there was no violence being done to the Constitution of St. Lucia, that is the supreme law of the land. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. There was no violence being done to the Constitution, so we believe, and we ask honorable members to support the amendment of the Act, as I said, particularly Section 32. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable members, the question is that the Public Finance Management Amendment Bill be read a second time. Member for Susan Saltibus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I must say when I saw this bill come into Parliament, I was rather surprised, particularly having listened to the Prime Minister for a couple of years and knowing his training and what he stands for. In fact, I remember many years ago, you might not recall, but in another life, he came to me for something, and his exact was what, you know these fellas already, I have to do things right. And this legislation that was passed last year, I actually went back to the time when it was passed to seeing the reaction from members opposite then. And the exact words of the Prime Minister now was that this is a very important piece of legislation. In fact, he went further to indicate that it provided some hope, and he hoped that it would create more accountability. And I say so because the person he is, Mr. Speaker, I believe he does stand for best practice. And implementing this bill, when we did, Mr. Speaker, it was all about following best practice, adhering to the fiscal rules that were out there, Mr. Speaker. And I think it also would have elevated the confidence in some of the agencies that would lend us monies. And so I think what is being done today kind of waters that down, Mr. Speaker. I heard the Prime Minister also speak to the fact that it was not in line with what our Constitution provides. But there was also, Mr. Speaker, that same review that I did at the time where the member for Beaufort South, who we have heard time and time again, we've heard the accolades being laid upon him as when it comes to the Constitution. And I remember his words was, it was not against the Constitution in terms of the bill that was being passed then. So, however, in listening to the member, I think the real reason is because of, obviously, there seemed to be some sort of stress at this point in time on the members in the Ministry of Finance in terms of, to put things together. So I think that is the real reason, and not necessarily the fact that it's not in line with our Constitution. So I'm hoping that in the interest of not watering down, where we have come to as it relates to preparing our estimates, Mr. Speaker, and the possibility of maybe even our ratings being affected, that very soon we will see this being reverted to what is it. Because there are countries, Mr. Speaker, who follow exactly what we're doing there, Mr. Speaker, because they recognize it as best practice, that you at least get your estimates and you present your figures before the end of the fiscal year, Mr. Speaker. I think that's the best way to do it. So it is a bit of concern. It's concerning to me that we would water down what I felt was a good piece of legislation. So in essence, that is my contribution to the bill. Thank you. I know how the game is going now.
You want to close the debate? Member for Miku South.
Can I ask for the podium? I thank the Prime Minister for his notes on the amendments that are being proposed. Mr. Speaker, I think to understand the severity of the changes that are being made, we need to understand what public financial management system is. And how did we get to where we are? And what was the genesis of this bill, this act in the first place? So the fact is, we have to ask ourselves, why would we have a PMF? And I make reference to the Chartered Institute of Public Finance Accounting. I'll certainly make this document a document out, although it's much longer, but it's also available online, Mr. Speaker. And it says, good governance in the public service requires a focus on the organization's purpose and its intended social outcomes. It also carries a specific obligation to citizens, taxpayers, and service users to make best use of resources and ensure the value of money. Financial management, therefore, is a core corporate discipline that should be reflected in a corporate governance framework covering all of the entity's activities, financial and non-financial, along with the duty of public service leaders to determine the allocation of resources to manage a different document. I'm going to be making this one available as well. And to manage resource use and performance objectives. I only have 2 quotes from this one. To maintain a system of controls to assess and manage risk, to uphold high standards of behavior, and to take informed and transparent decisions which are subject to scrutiny, to develop capacity and the capability across organization, and to engage with stakeholders. This will enhance the quality and transparency of public sector financial reporting and strengthen public confidence in public sector financial management. Standards may be set at a national level. So, Mr. Speaker, a key element is the timing of your budget. So detailed service budgets should explain allocations to individual services and be the basis for the managers to operate throughout the year. Individual spending units should have an opportunity to input to budget preparation to strengthen credibility and should be notified of their budget allocations before the year begins so that they can plan their commitments and fulfill their policy goals. So in essence, what is this saying, Mr. Speaker? That in order for a government to do a better job of ensuring that the resources to deliver the services that the citizenry needs, that one of the things that has been studied over a period of time is that the lack of a proper public management financial system rules deters from doing that. And what have we seen, Mr. Speaker? If we go to the IMF reports, I start with the IMF report, which is already a document of the House, of 2017. And this is the Article 4 consultation. And it says, that the fiscal year 2017-2018 budget, therefore, presents an opportunity for the authorities to demonstrate their commitment to fiscal responsibility and clarify their intentions on a broad range of policies. A more stable fiscal position and reduced uncertainty about the government's economic program would pave the way to stronger domestic and foreign investment. It goes on and says, an appropriate fiscal rule would adequately support the adjusted effort. The PFM bill contains some welcome steps to strengthen the budget process and move towards a medium-term fiscal framework, but is not adequately tied to the debt target of 60% by 2030. A fiscal rule enshrined in fiscal responsibility legislation would be necessary to ensure the appropriate institutional arrangements for enhanced fiscal transparency and accountability. If you then go to Article 4 of 2018, again, directors noted that while the rapid increase in infrastructure investment is necessary to address constraints to growth, the ensuing increase in public debt and the risk associated with its repayment heighten fiscal vulnerabilities. Directors supported the authorities' plans to strengthen public financial management based on the Public Expenditure and Financial Accountability Assessment, including revising the PFM Act and reviving the Public Sector Investment Program.
Member from Miku South, I'm trying to follow your response to the bill. The bill I have before me, and I assume that's the one you have, is saying that the amendment made in the PFM bill is inconsistent with the Constitution of St. Lucia. That is what we are debating here. This bill seeks merely to say the supremacy of the Constitution as opposed to a bill, that you cannot amend the Constitution by a simple bill. Section 79 of the Constitution is a section that requires a 2/3 majority to amend it, but you can't amend it by a simple bill. This is what I understand this amendment to be saying, that they are merely establishing the supremacy of the Constitution over a regular statute. That the Constitution says you have 30 days following the end of the financial year in which to present estimates, and a further 30 days in which to present the appropriation bill. This is what we are debating. What you are presenting is an entirely different matter which you cannot be allowed to, cannot be permitted to continue because this is not the bill before us. So you would need to restrict your responses to the bill. The bill before us is simply saying that the previous amendment is ultra vires the Constitution and that you are reverting to the status quo of giving the Constitution supremacy. So please restrict your comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. But with the greatest amount of respect, I would have thought that a member, particularly a member who was the former Minister of Finance and presided over the implementation of this, would have been given the latitude, and especially considering that the opposition only has 2 speakers. And again, I want to point out that the members on the other side, 15 speakers, choose to play a cat and mouse game, Mr. Speaker, and cause the opposition to want to speak first. But that's okay, Mr. Speaker. But at this point, Mr. Speaker, I will get to the issue that you've brought because that's a core issue. But what I first wanted to be able to do, Mr. Speaker, is to establish the importance of a PFM and particularly some of the components of it that are critical to its effectiveness. And one of those components, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that you ought to have your PFM, your budget approved before the end of the fiscal year.
I understand that. The point is, even assuming that you are correct, then the way to do it is by an amendment of the Constitution, not by regular statute.
Mr. Speaker, if you'd like me to start from the end, and you would like to come and give my speech, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to do that. But if
No, my role here is to ensure that the rules of the House...
Mr. Speaker,
when I'm speaking, member, nobody else speaks. My role here is to ensure that the rules of the House are followed. The rules of the House, member for Ashby Central, that goes for you too. The rules are that you deal with the bill that is before you. The fact that it might be more prudent for the estimates to be laid prior to the financial year end, that's a debate you can have among yourselves. What you cannot have is to deal with something that is not before the House. And I would urge you with the greatest of respect to keep to the bill or you will not be allowed to proceed.
So, Mr. Speaker, are we suggesting that the bill only contains that one component?
It certainly does not contain the components you are bringing into it.
Sure.
That's the point.
But, Mr. Speaker, the
Remember, I have ruled on that. We're not going to go on a back and forth for that.
Okay, Mr. Speaker.
You will
Let me
keep
start
to the bill or you will not speak at all.
Let me start from the back, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Section 79 of the Constitution reads as follows. 1. The minister for the time being responsible for finance shall cause to be prepared and laid before the House, and the operative word here, before or not later than 30 days after the commencement of each financial year, estimates of the revenues and expenditures of St. Lucia for that financial year. Before or no later than. So in essence, what the Constitution has done has established an outer limit. It says that for all intent and purposes, the budget cannot be laid later than 30 days after the completion of the budget. But it also gives provisions for it to be laid before. I'm happy to take on that debate with the member from Castries Central. So, Mr. Speaker, the former Attorney General had advised government that it was not in conflict with the Constitution. And also is that we have a very learned person when it comes to the Constitution of this country, who, when this bill was being debated, said, and I quote, "The section clauses 32 dealing with the appropriation of bill virtually just adds to what the Constitution has said and authorized it." And that is the member from Beaufort South. Let me repeat it again. I'm not. This is a quote, a direct quote. There's no before and after. The after says, so I'm not going to spend some time there. I wanted to touch briefly on clause 59. So in essence, and the member is here, and he certainly could make reference for himself, but the fact is that the argument that this is in conflict with the Constitution is erroneous. The Constitution gives the provision for you to have it before. It doesn't say you shall have it 30 days after. It says it shall not exceed 30 days afterwards. And we're getting into a constitutional matter. But the reality is given that latitude in the Constitution, and then wanting to practice best practices, and that is why, again, now the argument was to show that there are best practices, and why those best practices are put in place. So I contend, Mr. Speaker, that the information that this decision is being based on is erroneous. And I believe the Constitution has been framed in a way that we're not in breach of the Constitution if, in fact, you want to have that date before. Now, this is why the document that I circulated, Mr. Speaker, becomes a very relevant piece of document. Why? Because this document speaks specifically to why you want to have laws in your budget. Speaks to good practices, best practices. And it speaks to the importance of transparency and accountability in doing that. So, Mr. Speaker, it says, the outcomes of the budget process depend heavily on whether there are clear rules for formulating, executing, and reporting on the annual budget, as well as clear statement of medium-term fiscal term policy objectives. These rules are usually specified in a budget system law or set of laws that provides guidance for the different steps of budget processes and specifies the budget responsibilities of the key actions. This guidance note focuses on the key questions to be raised when there is a proposal to revise or replace an existing BSL. The objective of the formal rules are to specify what budgetary processes are prescribed in law and who is responsible, and when key budgetary steps should be taken. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the timing, it says, why adopt new law relating to the budgetary system, which is on page 2. Countries will adopt a new law or modify an existing one for a variety of reasons. And so the laws we're speaking of is exactly what is put into the act that we passed. For a variety of reasons, including one, to address specific budget-related problems. So the fact is, Mr. Speaker, the IMF and the World Bank and the CDB and many organizations, CARICRIS, have identified over the years in St. Lucia we have a budgetary problem. And we've not been managing our budget to the extent that we should have been. And there's a lot left to be desired. 2, to introduce new budget principles such as transparency, accountability, fiscal stability and sustainability, and budget performance. And 2, to strengthen or clarify the authority of the legislator or the executive. The BSL should be a tool that enables the authorities to achieve their desired policy objectives. In particular, the BSL should provide the framework for achieving 5 aims of well-functioning public financial management system. 1, attaining short-term macro-fiscal stability and medium-term fiscal sustainability. 2, enhancing the allocation of budgetary resources. 3, improving the efficiency of spending, ensuring that cash is managed optimally. And 5, page 2.
Remember, again, I'm trying to follow your line of reasoning with regard to the bill that is before us. You have posited that the Attorney General under your administration gave a specific opinion. The current Minister of Finance has brought a bill, and by bringing that bill, he is suggesting that his current Attorney General is of a different opinion. I am not a constitutional expert. This is not a court of law. We are not here to make determinations. But the fact is, all this amendment seeks to do is to change what was passed last year to suggest that the limits in the Constitution of a month thereafter are no longer applicable, and that you can, by statute, amend Section 79 of the Constitution, which under Section 41 of the Constitution says can only be amended by a parliament with a 3/4 majority. This is the essence of what is before us. All of what you're saying there might well be proper for the Minister of Finance to take back to his ministry when he's preparing his budget. It is of no relevance here. And if you're not going to stick to the bill, I will ask you to take your seat.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to repeat myself again. Section
I
79.
will not repeat myself
Okay. That's your prerogative, Mr. Speaker.
because
Section 79 of the Constitution clearly says that the budget can be laid no later than the 30 days after the fiscal year, or before. I'm not so sure if I'm misreading the English language, but what I'd like to say is that the government should take that heed, and even if they may think that they're right constitutionally, the fact is that the language of the Constitution gives them the ability to do it before. And I would like...
And that is what you should limit your debate to. You should encourage the government that, notwithstanding that the Constitution gives them an outer limit of a month, it is better and more prudent to do it before. That's the argument.
And that's what I'm doing.
No, that's not what you're doing. What you're going into a fiscal policy of achieving infrastructural determinations. That is not before us, and I cannot permit you to continue.
No, Mr.
And
Speaker.
I will not be saying this again. If you
Thank you, Mr.
stray, you will have to take your seat.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, I'm guided by you, but I thought that's exactly what I was doing, was explaining the importance of having a best practice PFM in place, and why it's necessary. And so I'm guided by documents that are done by the World Bank and the IMF.
But the World Bank is not our Constitution.
It's not our Constitution, but it explains, Mr. Speaker, the importance of a PMF.
But we're not disputing the importance of a PMF member. We are disputing that there is a school of thought supported by an Attorney General that the law which was passed in the last Parliament was ultra-vires the Constitution, as it took away the ability given by the Constitution to do certain things at a certain time. That is all we have before us, member.
So, Mr. Speaker, again, I'm going to say that the Constitution, in my mind, is very clear that the government can lay the budget before the House.
That is not in dispute.
Okay.
That is not in dispute whether the government can lay it before.
In saying that, okay, again in the document, page 10, budget submission timing. If not included in the Constitution, the BSL should specify the date by which the executive must submit the draft annual budget to the legislator.
But this is in the budget, it is in the Constitution.
And the Constitution gives it the latitude to have...
Remember, I'm not going to argue this. If you proceed, I will just stop you.
Fair enough, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, if I can make reference to best practices, let's take a country in which the government seems to have favor with and wants to emulate in many ways, and that is Barbados. What does Barbados's PFM say with regards to the timing of the budget? It says that the annual budget shall be laid by the minister responsible for finance in Parliament no later than the 15th of March of the year prior to the year to which it relates. Parliament shall approve the annual budget for the forthcoming financial year no later than the 31st of the financial year prior to the year which the annual budget relates. Prior. Grenada.
But remember this, Barbados have a provision similar to our 79-1.
They do.
But if you're going to present that,
Mr. Speaker,
if you're going to present the PMF, certainly you must present their constitutional counterpart to our 79.
their provision says that you should have the budget before the end of the fiscal year. Our budget, our Constitution gives the government the latitude of an outer limit, but does not in any way prohibit them from having it earlier. And I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, if in fact we pass this bill, and I understand the difficulties that the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance has indicated, I went through the same things. But the reality is every effort should be to make that happen. If in fact, Mr. Speaker, that we're going to continue to water down the rules that we've established for ourselves of good policies, then we're going to defeat the purpose of what we had. And it is what caused the problems in the first place, Mr. Speaker. In Grenada, Parliament shall have the sole authority and responsibility to review and approve the proposed budget prior to the commencement of the fiscal year in accordance with the provisions in the Constitution. Our Constitution doesn't speak specifically, it creates an outer limit. Now, if in fact we are within the framework of that outer limit, then, and we know what the best practices are, we see what the IMF and the World Bank, and we see what other countries who are highly regarded in terms of the management of their finances are doing, why would we want to do that? The fact is that members on this side who are on the opposite side and running the government sat here and knew when we were passing the financial bill. Okay? So the fact is, yes, and again that brings up another issue. In all of the other laws in those countries I made reference to, they do not give them the opportunity for an extension. In our PMF, it does give it the latitude for an extension. Under extraordinary circumstances, which is what? Under a state of emergency. And so it begs the question even for that, Mr. Speaker. If members on the opposite side have imposed a confinement, curfew, without a state of emergency, why couldn't they use the COVID Act to justify the extension on this particular circumstance? Because there's a fundamental difference between the two. But the reality is, under other circumstances, both in Grenada and in Barbados and in other countries, but I took those two countries because one, there's a high regard for Barbados, and two, Grenada is regarded as one of the best countries in the OECS when it came to its fiscal rules and its public financial management system. And the reality is that they don't even have the ability of getting an extension passed. It must be. And that's the point I'm trying to make, Mr. Speaker. If we don't hold ourselves accountable to what good practices are, then the things that we expect it to do are not going to happen. And that is the reality. And the reality is that if we give ourselves the opportunity for extending, and let's face it, so they're saying that they're going to be able to extend the presentation of the estimates, the laying of the estimates, until the end of April, which means then you have another 30 days after that for the appropriations bill. And the same thing that we have done for many years, in which we find ourselves more often than not approving a budget in the beginning of a new fiscal year. And that doesn't work. All the documents speak to that, Mr. Speaker, as a core element of our PFM. And I'm appealing to the government not to make this mistake. And once we start now going down the slippery slope of watering down what's supposed to be difficult things, and the purpose, and that's why I gave you the document, the purpose of the laws that we're implementing in the PFM are to hold us accountable. And ultimately to whom? To the people. And how does this affect the people? Is when we continue not to manage the affairs of the country in a transparent and accountable way. And we allow our budgets to slip It means that the monies to be able to fix roads, the monies to fix schools, the money to fix healthcare centers, they will not be there. We will go back to the days of where we used to allocate $1 million for fixing roads and less than $1 million a year for fixing schools. And that the social programs that we have are not going to be there. But that is the reality. And I'm proud of the fact that my administration felt the need, understood the sense of urgency, and worked with the IMF and the World Bank. So even when we talked about being able to get access to concessionary funds, Mr. Speaker, during a time of crisis, in a large part it was facilitated because of the confidence that they had in us, because we were committed to passing these fiscal rules. And that's the point we're trying to talk about. So, Mr. Speaker, the timing of it is one issue. The other amendments that are being made, Mr. Speaker, is the element with regards to the allocation of expenditure, recurrent expenditure and capital.
Mr. Speaker, the member is in the House. There is absolutely nothing in that bill that speaks to capital.
Well, you will notice, Minister of Finance, that I preface my statement by saying the bill I have, which I'm hoping is the same bill that the member has, because the member was going down a path that clearly did not lead to the bill I have.
So even now, Member
Well, Mr. Speaker, I always stand to be corrected, but the document that was circulated to us on Friday,
another document was circulated to you this morning.
I did not get the one this morning.
Oh, okay.
So if in fact the component in it that takes away the authority of, because in the bill that we saw, what was being recommended, Mr. Speaker, was that you could transfer monies from your capital accounts into your recurrent accounts. Mr. Speaker, that is what I read. If in fact this changed, then I will retract that. It's not a problem.
The member has
Acknowledged not having received the, he got it from the member for Suzel.
I apologize, I did not get it. Okay? So the point is, and I want to really talk about, Mr. Speaker, it is about best practices. It is about having a structure, and it is a difficult process, Mr. Speaker. I went through that. But the reality is that we will all be better off for it. And I can say to you, Mr. Speaker, with regards to the timing of your budget, every single document recommends that we do the budget and prove the budget before the end of the fiscal year. And you know, Mr. Speaker, there are also some other very interesting recommendations that were being made. And it's certainly the things that we could potentially maybe look at down the road. Independent budget offices. One of the page 15. You know, one of the things that I believe debilitates both governments is people's confidence in the information they're receiving. And so what this is recommending is that there be an independent budget office. And so therefore, when that office is evaluating the budget proposals, that everybody knows that it came from a nonpartisan direction. And you see, Mr. Speaker, if we get engaged in irresponsible debates about the finances of our country, what we are doing is undermining our own reputation. And we're making it even more difficult for ourselves. And that's a reality. And so, producing information which everyone, the man on the street, businesses, small businesses, and international institutions can rely on and have confidence that it is fair and it is accurate. But in order to do that, Mr. Speaker, the rules that have been established in the PFM, if anything, should be strengthened and not weakened. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, my mic is on.
The member for Castries Central. Member for Viewfort South. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I really had little intention to speak today, although I was on the threshold of indecision for most part of the morning. But my name having been mentioned, either not directly, but in a formal capacity on the opposition benches, I thought it might be a very helpful thing if things are placed into context. And reference was made to constitutional credentials, and it's not often that I get such kind words from the opposition regarding my constitutional credentials, because as you know, Mr. Speaker, if you have been following previous sittings of the House, you know that I was treated sometimes with great dismay and ridicule, especially from the former member from Castries Southeast. But that being said, Mr. Speaker, I am perplexed, I am a little confused, and maybe it's just the time of day that my mind doesn't focus and function as properly as it should. But the truth of the matter is that I don't understand what is the sin that the government has committed. And I'm not too sure how it is that the member for Mikus South can pillory a government seeking to return to the Constitution, and I shall come to that in a few minutes. I don't understand it. So there's a gap in logic, and I tend to want to follow things step by step. So I'm a little bewildered, and it's really just a pity that the member for Mikus South, by placement on the opposition benches, don't have a right of reply before closure of the debate. But I'm just a little mystified and confused, Mr. Speaker. Let me say, Mr. Speaker, that it is well to dwell on the history of this country over the last years since independence. The particular section of the Constitution that governs the presentation of estimates of revenue and expenditure, I think it is Section 79, to be precise, has been the subject of dispute before, and also, Mr. Speaker, has been a subject of litigation. I recall when Sir Julian Hunt sat on the opposition benches, Mr. Speaker, during the tenure of Sir John. Now, there was a particular year when the estimates were late in the House, and Sir Julian Hunt proceeded to the courts to get an order from the courts, or a declaration rather, that the provision of the Constitution had been breached. And for me, these things remain essential reading for anybody who wants to be Minister of Finance or to be a leading spokesman on financial matters. It's very important that these judgments be read. The then judge was Madam Justice Susie Dovey, deceased, and she ruled against Sir Julian Hunt on the grounds that by the time the matter was ripe for determination, I'm trying to remember well, that in fact Sir John had presented the budget to the House, and the question therefore was moot as to whether the declaration was necessary. And I am really relying on my memory, and I notice that the member for Castries North is nodding to substantiate what I have just said. So that there's always been a contention, despite the plain words of the Constitution, and there's no question that historically there has been periods when the estimates of expenditure, of revenue and expenditure have been laid or presented to the House fairly late, particularly the 1 month period after the Constitution has prescribed. Now that being said, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy that the Leader of the Opposition, the member for Micoud South, has indicated that he was unaware that there had been a new bill circulated this morning with the adjustments. And it is to his credit, and the only thing I was hoping he would have done was to ask you, Mr. Speaker, to strike out everything from the record what he had said up to that point. Because it was very clear that he was addressing a bill that was not before the House. And I think if he had listened more carefully to your guidance, he might have picked up that something was wrong, and perhaps that was not the road to follow. So unfortunately, that is in the record, but clearly these errors are made from time to time in the passage of legislation, and it would mean, of course, for his own future guidance, he has to check his desk thoroughly to make sure that bills are not adjusted prior to the commencement of the House. But because of the information that has been made available to the public, and because there are allegations of major transgressions, that sins have been committed, that the rules of transparency are being broken, the progressive steps taken to clear up the budgetary processes, we are going backwards and we are not going forwards. And if I am correct again, Mr. Speaker, correct, if I'm correct, I believe that it was a former Labour administration that had in fact enacted this bill before, the Public Finance Management Act. It was done in the closing year of the elections, I think sometime in 2016. Am I correct? And when that bill was presented to the House at the time, I had the honor to be Minister of Finance, and in making sure that the bill went through all three stages, I did indicate that there were some very unhappy sections in that legislation, and that at some point, again, confirmation, that bill would have to be revisited. The legislation will have to be revisited. And Mr. Speaker, if I may, I recall very well that there was one section of that bill that had caused consternation to the then Leader of the Opposition, the member for Micoud South, the Honorable Gail Rigobert. And in fact, I delayed to allow the opportunity for comments to be made after the passage of the bill. I did explain to her that it was vital that we secure the passage of the bill because it was a condition laid by the Caribbean Development Bank, misguided as the Caribbean Development Bank is. Misguided, and that funds for the development of the country were being held up because we were not satisfying the condition. So I think you will concede that legislation was in fact enacted during that tenure, and I see the Attorney General frowning now that he's a member of this House in accordance with the Constitution, as should have always been the case. I see he's frowning, but of course he has to remain mute. So that being said, Mr. Speaker, I am the first to admit that act will require adjustments at some point, and perhaps it would be a good thing that a committee of the House looks into it and proposes the adjustments. And I just simply want to tell the member from Micoud South, be very wary of the World Bank and the IMF when they give constitutional advice. Be very, very wary. They are okay if they give general financial advice. When IMF comes down, does its Article 4, okay on financial issues. But never constitutional advice. You ought to treat it with the deepest degree of suspicion possible. Why? because they don't understand the constitutions of the Commonwealth Caribbean countries. They just don't. And they always make mistakes. Some of them blindly apply what they learn in the passage of time from what American lawyers say on television and then apply it. Others simply don't take the time to read. And it's not just a problem with them. It is also a problem even with our Caribbean development banks that sometimes they do not understand the constitutional rigors or prescriptions that apply. So I would say that we need to be very careful when it comes to whatever advice that is being offered. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable member from Miku South wants to intervene. I don't know if it's a point of clarification.
Is it a point of order?
I'm not bound to give way, but I'm in a generous mood, Mr. Speaker, and I'll give way to him.
Member from Miku South?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to the member of Miku's sort of Viewport South generosity. Mr. Speaker, I certainly want to clarify that at no point, and if it was understood that way, I want to clarify it. At no point did I say that the IMF or the World Bank was commenting or giving advice on our Constitution, because I don't think that there was their role. No, okay. Well, I just want to make just okay. So you said okay, and yeah, okay. And what I do want to say was what I was through the chair, Speaker. What I do want to say on this matter is that we are being guided, and the reality is we're talking about best practices. Okay, and that is the focus of my presentation. So it's about best practices, and I think the member from Viewport South is actually in a better place to make commentary on that, because he himself knows the difficulties we've faced in keeping to our budgets. And the fact is, fiscal discipline, if I can use that word, Mr. Speaker, has been something that has been void in our country, and I believe that the PFM is attempting to resolve that issue.
Mr. Speaker, that we ought to be very wary and very careful when they make suggestions, IMF, World Bank, about interfering with our laws, amending our laws, because they don't often seek the quality of advice to premise their recommendations. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think it is useful if we compare what was circulated before and what was circulated today, because both attract comments in their own rights. The first draft of the bill, dated January 28th, according to the notice I received from Parliament, made provision for the amendment of Section 2 of the Public Finance Management Act, amendment to the current expenditure. Then it included a clause 4, amended Section 27 regarding the issuance of fiscal policy statements, and amended that, attempted to amend that. And then clause 5, which of course is the current clause that we are debating. The minister shall cause to be prepared and laid before the House of Assembly no later than 30 days after the commencement of each financial year estimates for that financial year. And then it goes on to add under clause B, by deleting subsection 3 and by substituting the following: the House of Assembly shall approve the appropriation bill no later than 30 days after the laying of the estimates before the House of Assembly. So the logic is very clear. You lay your estimates and you have up to 30 days to present the appropriation bill and make your budgetary statement. And then there are subsequent amendments regarding time and so on. The bill that was circulated, Mr. Speaker, today, this morning, and it's not a good practice, Mr. Speaker, let me add, unless it's a matter of extreme urgency to be changing bills on the eve of a debate in Parliament. I certainly don't support practices like that. But sometimes I would say that it becomes necessary because I think the Attorney General decided that perhaps this was not the time to consider other aspects of the previous bill, but focus exclusively on this matter of the presentation of the estimates of revenue and expenditure. So it has a new clause 3, and it says, the minister shall cause to be prepared and laid before the House of Assembly no later than 30 days after the commencement of each financial year, estimates for the financial year. And then it goes on the clause 3B to provide for the laying of the appropriation bill, which need not concern us. So this is a different version of what was circulated. Very different. Now, that being said, Mr. Speaker, I want to focus on what may have caused a member from Mico South to speak with such excitement and passion and energy a while ago. Of course it is a compliment. I mean, but sometimes we all go to our deaths with passion, you know that. These things happen from time to time, so you have to be careful how you manage passion. Passion can be a lethal human condition, and it has a history of causing a lot of problems for a lot of people. So you have to manage passion very, very, very carefully. Well advised. Yeah, well, at my age I can offer advice gratuitously. Now, Mr. Speaker, that being said, the contention here is that the government is not committing any evil. What it is seeking to do is to return to the constitutional prescription. And I well recall, Mr. Speaker, when the amendments were introduced by the former government and the debate on the provisions of the existing act and the amendment bill. I wish, Mr. Speaker, I had before me today the Hansard record, and I really do hope that we can find a way to provide the resources to Parliament to make Hansard available in a more timely manner, Mr. Speaker. And I know that you will be able to attend to this in due course so that we can have access to it, because I would have loved to revisit what I said on that occasion. And I'm being handed a copy. I won't have the time to go through it, but the member for Mico South does have a transcript. I suspect it's redacted, parts of the whole transcript. So, well, no, I spoke for longer than that, but let's put that there for a minute. Let's leave it there just for a minute. Now, Mr. Speaker, let us very quickly turn now to the Constitution and Section 79 and what it says. Section 79 of the Constitution, from where this provision is taken, says, the minister for the time being responsible for finance shall cause to be prepared and laid before the House before or not later than 30 days after the commencement of each financial year, estimates of the revenue and expenditure of St. Lucia for that financial year. That's what it says, 79. And I suspect all of us by now know that section exceedingly well. Now, when the former government introduced the amendments to the legislation, I attempted to deal with some of the constitutional issues. And again, I haven't had a chance to read the record that the member from Mico South made available to me. I will certainly do so at some point. But I remember standing up and making the point that Parliament should avoid legislating provisions in acts where the Constitution also speaks to the very same subject or to the same field or to the same matter. I suggested then that the courts had developed a doctrine called covering of the field doctrine. I may not have used that technical term, but the essence of it, I think, was captured in my presentation. That your Constitution is your highest law. All laws are subservient to your Constitution. All laws are inferior to your Constitution. all laws get their validity from what the Constitution says. Therefore, when the Constitution speaks, there is no need for ordinary statute to be enacted to repeat what the Constitution says. Because the Constitution is the supreme law. The law applies irrespective of whether Parliament interferes with it or not. It's called covering of the field. Once the Constitution speaks to the particular subject or the particular matter, to the particular field, there is no need to enact statutes. And that, I think, was the point at the time. And yes, I do remember, Mr. Speaker, the member for Swazelle looking at me most intently on that day. And he was agreeing with me, nodding occasionally, when the member from Miku South was not looking at him. I remember that. Do you remember that? Do you remember that? I tell you, Mr. Speaker. I tell you. So, Mr. Speaker, I made that point then. And as is often the case, the point was, I think, ridiculed, disregarded, and dismissed. I also, I believe, went on to say, Mr. Speaker, that in respect of the provision regarding policy statements, and I noticed that the government did not proceed with the clause amending that was pulled out, as I have explained from the bill that was circulated this morning, it is not there. I even suggested to the then government that they look at that very carefully, and if my memory is incorrect, Mr. Speaker, I ask you to forgive me. I don't have the full Hansard record. But I try to suggest that when you are delivering a budget policy statement, you are in fact delivering a policy statement to govern the financial affairs of the country. Therefore, the suggestion that you may want to come back 3 months later when you just delivered a financial statement, a budgetary statement, which is a policy statement, which we, over the last few years, and even the former government obeyed it, understood the distinction between estimates of expenditure and policy statement, and to their credit, they followed through with a budget policy statement, as had happened before, when we restored the budgetary process. And then one can therefore cast any blemish of any where that is concerned. But the point, Mr. Speaker, was that if you have done a policy statement by way of a budgetary statement, and then to come back 3 months later to deliver another policy statement when the budget hardly has the opportunity to take root and to deliver the promises that it seeks to establish, it may not make much sense because you may not have much to report on, except, of course, if you are dealing with a situation of radical structural adjustment of the economy, which St. Lucia is yet to undergo for all practical purposes. In that sense, therefore, it may be too much to have a policy statement every 3 months. But happily, of course, this is not an issue because the government has withdrawn that section to amend the previous legislation. So we are left basically with this section regarding when the estimates of revenue and expenditure. Mr. Speaker, it's not for me to tell a draftsman what to do. It's just for me, I think, to lay out the principles as I indicated. And my position has always been, if the Constitution speaks clearly, leave it alone, don't interfere with it. Let the Constitution speak and let it guide. The problem, however, is this. The former government went ahead and enacted legislation in pursuant to Section 79. And here we are debating whether what was done was correct or incorrect. Or we are touching on this issue. My position, Mr. Speaker, and I repeat, is if your Constitution has a provision, don't interfere. But the problem is, once the former government had decided to enact a provision that touched Section 79, that seek to give Section 79 a certain kind of meaning, a certain kind of flavor, as ordinary statute, then this government, its successor government, has a responsibility to correct what was in the previous legislation by repudiating it. That's the reality. And left to me, Mr. Speaker, all I would have simply have done was to introduce the legislation, repudiate the previous section that was enacted by the former government, delete it, expune it from the legislation. I wouldn't even bother enact Clause 3, Subclause 1, because consistent with what I believe the Constitution already speaks. I wish, however, Mr. Speaker, and this was circulated this morning, just to alert the Attorney General to a little matter, because it seems seems to have caused the greatest degree of consternation to the member of Mifumiku South. The amendment clause says the minister shall cause to be prepared and laid before the House of Assembly no later than 30 days after the commencement of each financial year, estimates for that financial year. I think what happened here was that the Attorney General or the person drafting the bill left out the words before or not later than, before or not later. Those three little words were left out. So for this section to be consistent with Section 79, it requires those three little words, before or not. And I think this is what excited the member for Migu South. This is the cause of the great excitement, because he seems to believe that if you left out the words before or not, then what you are doing is to take away your own power to introduce the estimates of expenditure, not before the April 30th. Now, by a process of reasoning, by a process of logic, you can get over the words no later than, because what it means, no later than, obviously has to mean any time before that. Any time before that. But to use a Latin term that we lawyers love to use, and it's not often I get a chance, ex abundante cautela. We lawyers speak of the term ex abundante cautela, out of an abundance of caution. If you're going to repeat a provision of the Constitution, make sure you repeat it in its entirety, not leave out words. So, really, this should be, Mr. Attorney General, the minister shall cause to be prepared and laid before the House before or not later than 30 days after the commencement of each financial year, estimates for that financial year. So that then puts it on par with the constitutional provision, though my own attitude has been, but lawyers differ, attorneys general differ. I would simply have repealed what was there before in the previous legislation and don't even bother with this, because the Constitution speaks to it. So I believe, therefore, that the member for Migu South really will have to, as we say on the block, wheel and come again. He'll have to wheel and come again and choose a more appropriate moment when we can have a more robust debate on the legislation. But really, this was not the one to pick a fight, because all that the government was doing was seeking to correct an error which your former Attorney General was most reluctant to concede. And, well, I mean, it's not just him, but the member for Castries Southeast, who was in charge of government legal business. I remember that. Mr. Speaker, I remember that. I know I have to speak with certain language, but nostalgia is a terrible thing. Mr. Speaker, leave that alone. I'll come back to that. Because I believe the member for Migu South will come back again, will come and wheel again. So an opportunity will arise. But I'm just saying, Mr. Speaker, that if those simple points could have been addressed at the time, maybe we would not have be in this debate with this ferocity for a problem that really does not exist. Because clearly what the government is attempting to do is to repudiate what had occurred in the past, reject it, ensuring that the integrity of the Constitution is protected by speaking to the Constitution. But, you know, I once used a word, Mr. Speaker, that became the title of a book. Mr. Speaker, I was addressing years ago, Mr. Speaker, some errors of judgment made by the then director of the Poverty Reduction Fund. And I said, well, you know, we all make mistakes, and this gentleman has committed some lapses and infelicities. Well, it's good for politicians to go down in history, you know. And here I am, Mr. Speaker, by my terminology, lapses and felicities, I provided a title for a book for somebody. Now, I believe I have never read the book. I have never, no, none of you better don't think giving me a gift of it, because I'll send it back to you. So if that's in your mind, don't do that. It's a risky business. But I'm just saying, Mr. Speaker, that I believe this is another classic example of lapses and infelicities coming from the AG's office, because all the AG has to do is to add the 3 words in here and resolve the problem. But then I would like to see our AG be more adventurous and perhaps on another occasion excise this completely and let the Constitution in all its radiance and all its glory, all its integrity speak for us, because it is the highest law of the land. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Just following on the member for Viewfort South, in my admonition of the member for Meekwood South, I had cautioned him about quoting another country's legislation without also being aware of what that country's constitution says. I have before me section 108 of the Barbados Constitution, and it says, the minister responsible for finance shall, before the end of the financial year, so there is no additional or no later. So what you would have quoted would be in keeping with this, but ours had the other conjunction of no later. So it's always a dangerous thing to quote legislation without also looking at the source of that legislation. The member of Castries Central.
Mr. Speaker, I don't intend to bore anybody in this House again, but to follow on the heels of such a constitutional powerhouse, whom I had the privilege of sitting in a classroom at Keyville campus, Barbados, to be lectured in constitutional law. So I really cannot add to what he has said, but I do believe, Mr. Speaker, that for the elucidation of the member from Miku South, who clearly has certainly become a constitutional, what are you, guru? I believe, Mr. Speaker, I just needed to throw some light on the proceedings today. And I now understand, Mr. Speaker, why we went 5 years without a deputy speaker. It had to be misconstruction and a misunderstanding of the Constitution. Section 120 of the Constitution says clearly, very clearly, unequivocally, it says, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, the Constitution is the supreme law of St. Lucia, and subject to the provisions of Section 41 of this Constitution, if any other law is inconsistent with this Constitution, the Constitution shall prevail, and the other law, to the extent of the consistency, is void. So any law passed that contravened or that was inconsistent with the Constitution would be void to the extent of the inconsistency. What is the inconsistency? Section 79 speaks to, Mr. Speaker, the minister for the time being responsible for finance shall cause to be prepared and be laid before the House, or not later than 30 days after the commencement of each financial year. That is the constitutional provision, and if we were to be guided by the stipulations of Section 120, we know that this is the supreme law. What did Section 32 of the PFM? It says, the minister shall not later than 30 days before the end of each financial year. So the Constitution says not later after the end, and this act says not later than before the end of the financial year. So there is almost, if you were to go to extremities, there is a 60-month gap, 60-day gap, between those two stipulations. When the Constitution under Section 120 tells you that if your piece of legislation is inconsistent with the Constitution, yours is void to the extent of the inconsistency. So as my learned friend indicated, member for Viewfort South, even if this was passed, this was bad law, and this piece of legislation is void. And I cannot understand, Mr. Speaker, how any Attorney General who is worth his or her grain of salt would say that the stipulations in the Public Finance Management Act under Section 32 were not inconsistent with Section 79 of the Constitution. And I would not think that the former Attorney General ever indicated that. It probably was imposed on him by the member for Miku South, who was the then leader of the United Workers' Party. Because that is how he operates. Now, you know, Mr. Speaker, I sat by and he began going down the road where I was waiting patiently, because for the member for Miku South to have the audacity to speak of taking informed and transparent decisions, I was wondering whether there was a transformation of the character I once knew as the member for Miku South. Informed and transparent. Is it the same person who at a UN summit meeting said that once transparency is what? So odious that it hinders development, that you can basically do away with transparency? Today speaks about transparency. Now, Mr. Speaker, I came here so properly armed. I came with a lot of ammunition because the member for Miku South provided the fodder which would have formed the basis for my contribution. The member for Miku South actually on his page on social media described this government as non-caring and opting to make amendments to the law which will take St. Lucia, and I quote, on a backward path in managing public spending. You know, on a backward path in managing public spending. And I began asking myself, was that the same Minister of Finance, member of Miku South, who from the inception came in and hired Ernst & Young, an accounting firm, to assist in the preparation of our budgetary estimates? Is that the same one who now speaks to public spending? Is that the same one, Mr. Speaker? He did it for 1 year, he did it for 2 years, he did it for 3 years. And when COVID hit us and our resources were diminishing, he reverted to the very civil servants he had once discarded as being no good. He reverted to them. And member for Miku South, if I lie, tell me I lie.
Mr. Speaker,
It is the same person.
Mr. Speaker, on that invitation, he lied. Thank you very much.
I beg your, I didn't get that, member.
Okay, very well,
I
Mr.
said
Speaker.
upon his invitation, Mr. Speaker, the information he's provided is a lie.
The information I am providing is a lie. Upon my invitation, I didn't say 4 years. I said 3 years. I said the first year, the second year, the third year, and the fourth year. When we were running broke, you reverted to the very civil servants you discarded. That is a fact.
Member of Castry Central, you address the chair.
Very well, Mr. Speaker, through you. And he speaks about spending, managed spending. Mr. Speaker, about 2 months before the elections of 2021, this member for Miku South and Minister of Finance authorized the payment of $7.3 million to purchase vaccines to a company that was never involved in pharmaceutical procurement. But guess what? The man was in business with his brother-in-law, and we paid him $7.3 million.
Mr. Speaker, again, are we going to allow a member of the House to impugn wrongdoing on another member of the House? I thought that was a contrary to our...
Absolutely. Member of Castry Central, I would suggest you not go down that path there.
Well, you see, Mr. Speaker, he speaks to transparency and accountability.
Yeah, but member of Castry Central, somebody having a procurement contract with a brother-in-law does not by itself impute an improper motive.
Oh, I never said about improper motive. I didn't even go when they acquired the land, and 2 weeks after another brother-in-law was at DCA.
Well, remember,
I didn't say that one yet.
They are innuendos, aren't they?
Okay. But Mr. Speaker, we had a situation where vaccines were needed and they were given to a company that was not involved in procurement. The Minister of Finance went on social media and said that they had done due diligence on the company. Due diligence. Guess what, Mr. Speaker? The year before, that very company had made a loss of £10 million in the UK. A cursory inspection of international businesses would have indicated that. The red flags would have flown up. The red flags, it was just like, who's the guy who was introducing if you working at the hotel again and all the red flags started flying? The one police wanted, I can't remember his name now. But Mr. Speaker, Jack Lam, where's Jack Lam? Where is Jack Lam? In Rodney Bay. Good. So Mr. Speaker, a cursory inspection of international businesses would have indicated that that company made a loss of $10 million. This Minister of Finance caused the taxpayers of this country to give this man $7.3 million. When he finally gave us back 2.6, he was still audacious enough to say, we are lucky we get some of our money back. The 4.7 is still outstanding, and we are with that money. But today has the audacity to talk about good and managed spending. We brought down horses in an air-conditioned plane, whilst our people were suffering. Horses in an air-conditioned plane we brought down.
Speaker, on a clarification, is the members...
Just a minute. It's a point of clarification. Are you yielding?
Yes, I'm yielding.
Is the member suggesting when he says we brought down the horses, can you provide greater clarity on that? Who is we?
Proceed, member.
You're asking me who's we? We brought down horses in an air-conditioned plane. In an air-conditioned plane while people were suffering. Mr. Speaker, I am sure you remember after June 6, 2016, there was much fanfare for the swearing in of the Cabinet of Ministers in View Fort, red carpet on the field, rooms for every minister at a hotel. Who's we? Rooms for every minister. Where did we swear in? Right here. Right here. It didn't cost us a penny.
Mr. Speaker,
For Swazell, a point of order, point of clarification.
I don't often do this, but
No, what is it that you're raising? Yeah, but what is it? Is it a point of order?
in the House and St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, to say that rooms were rented at a hotel for every member. But that is a false statement, Mr. Speaker. And the member cannot have that latitude to say what he wants like that, Mr. Speaker. Which rooms that were rented? Maybe somebody told you that they had a room, but I don't know about what you're talking about. They don't say them things, man.
I suspect they didn't rent for you. They didn't rent for you. Look at that. The member of the council is not the one to answer that because he had it. That was the kind of extravagance we got, Mr. Speaker. We got and now that same man wants to speak about management of funds. $32 million to Lockerbie to do what? To do what? And to tell us where to plant grass? Something that causes cancer. Lockerbie. Then you have Permandu. $11 million to Permandu. Acquired a hotel, Mr. Speaker, with registered debt of $135 million. Mont Jewel and ARCI invest in Lucia to pay for the hotel. Today, it had registered debt of 50 million US, 135 million EC. Yes, stand up on a point of order. Tell us how much you pay for it.
Mr. Speaker,
Members, another member does not invite another member to stand on a point of order. There is a procedure here that, so what is the point of order, member?
Mr. Speaker, clarity.
Pardon? But you can't stand because another member invites you.
Mr. Speaker, through you.
I invited this member to speak and he's inviting you to speak.
Mr. Speaker, I don't want him to feel insulted.
No, that's okay. That's all right. You can take your seat.
I can take a seat? Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, when you know you stand on grounds of factuality, he's asking me how much, and that is the problem, you know, Mr. Speaker. When the DSH agreement came out, there were how many amendments, but the first cry, we never signed that. The first cry is they never entered into an agreement. Today you talk about transparency, man. Today. $13 million to build a bypass road. $11 million took from NIC to buy replacement land. Today, you have the audacity to talk about transparency. Why you didn't let a board decide to rent the buildings from your father?
Member, please address the chair.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, yes, through you. If you want transparency and your father owns Colony House, Mr. Speaker, you really want transparency. You talk about an independent so-and-so budget gear. Have an independent body to determine the suitability of your father's premises, to determine the rental, to determine the longevity of the rental period, and let them come to a determination. On your watch, under your watch, 5 of government businesses went into your father's premises. And today, you know the word transparency. Huh? What's it? Hot son. Today, Mr. Speaker, you talk about transparency. Mr. Speaker, everybody knows there was a piece of land by Shock. C.O. Williams refused that land, notwithstanding being able and having the equipment and everything else to develop the land. Nobody wanted it. It went into receivership. What does the government do? A government led by the member for Miku South acquired the land. Acquired the land. And who was liaising with DCA for approval in principle? His brother-in-law. And now today you're talking about transparency. Transparency for what? Mr. Speaker, I made the point that lands were acquired, and he brought it up, that we only took 400 square feet from his father. The fact remains that your father's land is in the Gazette as being compulsorily acquired. It does not say how much. And the amount, the way the land was taken, Mr. Speaker, the configuration has changed. It has now become a liability on the public purse. Your father donated. Why didn't he do a deed of donation?
Member, if you have evidence to present to this House, member, just hold on. If you have evidence to present to this House that the government of St. Lucia paid for that land, present it. If not, I will have to go along with the members' comments that it was a donation.
No, I didn't say that I have documents that they paid for it. I said, Mr. Speaker, that it appeared in the Gazette as a piece of property that was compulsorily acquired.
But your indication that it was compulsorily acquired,
yes, it was,
is an innuendo statement to suggest that because it was not a deed of donation, it was paid for. He has said no, so don't proceed along those lines.
But Mr. Speaker,
you can make your point without
I agree. But he also admitted that it was compulsorily acquired. Under the Act, the Compulsory Acquisition Act, any property acquired by virtue of that act becomes a liability of the state. So let his father send a letter saying that you're no longer owe me. He did.
Member McCaskey,
let me move on.
You move away from that point.
Let me move on. So, Mr. Speaker, I mean, I could go on and on and on, but I don't want to hear the members speak of one constitutional interpretation, because he made a mockery of the Constitution when for 5 years we sat without a deputy speaker. And he said, based on his interpretation, it was not inconvenient for him. Well, it was convenient for the people of St. Lucia to throw him out on July 26, 2021. And that is the kind of interpretation, that is the kind of slyness with which this country was governed, Mr. Speaker. We talk about management. You came in, Mr. Speaker, found St. Jude 85% complete. 85% complete. And it was started under us, under Flabo. It was not by the Labour Party government. When Labour Party came in, they found it fitting to continue it. They never stopped, because it was in the interest of the people to have that project continue. And they came in, got a revenue stream of $20 million to complete it, but no, they stopped it. It would not lend to the kind of largesse that was prevalent in the government. They stopped it and spent over $100 million.
The member from Casfield Central is on a diatribe, and is continuing.
Member for Casfield Central. Remember, we did speak about that word before. It is not parliamentary language to use that word.
Diatribe certainly, the definition of diatribe, Mr. Speaker, is simply when members are using language to gang up on you. And I would suggest that that's an appropriate definition of what the member from Casfield Central has been doing all day. The reality is that when we came into government,
There is a standing letter which we've made, it's been made public and made a document of this House, Mr. Speaker. It has been made a letter from the Ministry of Economic Development on April of 2016, indicating that it would take another $100 million and over a year to complete the St. Jude's. So to suggest that St. Jude's was 85% complete, Mr. Speaker, when we came into office, is erroneous. And if the member would like, I'm happy to reproduce the letter for him, Mr. Speaker.
I don't want to engage in back and forth with a man who's a reputed stranger to the truth. I don't want to engage.
Again, the member from Castries Central is implying and impugning my name in the House. And I would seek that we follow the rules of the House, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah.
But if the member chooses to make those kinds of allegations in public, as he has done in the past, we'll deal with it then.
Yes.
And I'll be happy to come on his show and respond to his allegations.
Mr. Speaker, I'm expressing an invitation, extending rather,
Member,
an invitation to the member.
You will do that on Thursday, not
On
here.
Thursday, yes. No, but I said he's a reputed stranger to the truth, which I say all the time. You want examples? You want examples? 26 islands. Huh? We will build 26 islands. You remember that? Do you remember that? You remember when you were on the radio, in 1 minute later, you spoke about the price of gas. Then I never said that. You remember that? You remember in Mikud, you have a document on your desk to reduce the price of gas. As soon as you sign, it goes down. You remember that? You remember we have 1.5 billion to be spent in St. Lucia for the next 5 years. You remember that? Don't go down that road. Don't go down that road. Don't go down that road. You are a xenophobe. That's what you are.
Member, could you please address the chair?
I'm trying desperately.
Earlier this morning, you took offense at being called a friend.
Yes.
And now you insist on addressing the member directly.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Sorry. You know, Mr. Speaker, the thing is, I'm from Miku, and there are some little flies they call and they bother you sometimes. And I find myself almost in a similar set of circumstances. But basically, Mr. Speaker, I was letting this member for Miku South know he has no moral authority to speak on any kind of constitutionality. He has no moral authority to speak on anything that lends to the smallest bit of transparency. He has no moral authority to speak on accountability. I remember watching him in the House when he told the opposition then that from June 6, 2016, they had lost the right to speak. Yes. Yes, man. He further said they had lost their right to advise. And when people tried to advise him, Mr. Speaker, he said, I don't listen. I let the jackasses breathe. He's right here. I don't listen. I let the jackasses breathe. And call them barking dogs and mendicants and all sorts of things. And today you want to speak about management, accountability, and transparency. You have lost, you are no, Mr. Speaker, through you, I want to let the member know that he has no standing, no moral authority, none whatsoever, to speak to any issue of transparency, accountability, and constitutionality. And he made a mess of this country. The airport is another one. The airport, our biggest contract, Mr. Speaker, the biggest contract, the biggest single liability that this government will ever shoulder, was never put to tender. Never. But today, he has found his voice on transparency. And guess what, Mr. Speaker? He found everything in place to have done a PPP, a public-private partnership, without putting a penny of liability on the public purse, and it was stopped. it was stopped, and we had to go and borrow money to do what we otherwise could have done without spending a cent. And today, this very person...
Mr. Speaker, again, if this is going to continue...
Remember, when members rise, they need to wait to be recognized.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I apologize.
We have not recognized you.
What is a point of order, a point of elucidation? What is it?
Point of hallucination.
Are you yielding?
No, Mr. Speaker, not this time. Sit down. Yes, Mr. Speaker. An airport the people of this country could have had by now. All they had to do was to proceed with the former arrangement.
Mr. Speaker, the member from Castries, sir.
Again, Mr.
My apologies.
No, let's get this correct. Any member who stands must first indicate whether it's a point of order or a point of elucidation. If it is a point of elucidation, the member who is on his feet must decide to yield. If he says no, that person who attempts to interrupt shall sit without further comment. If it is a point of order, the speaker shall rule on it. Which is it?
Point of order.
And the point that is the order that is breached is?
Misleading the House, Mr. Speaker.
Okay.
Mr. Speaker,
Member Castries, you can take your seat temporarily.
Mr. Speaker, we're going to go back and forth all day. I thought we were here to debate a bill. You were very clear.
No, you are not going to give a speech now. You're going to,
No.
You're going to point out the misleading statement.
Okay, the misleading statement, Mr. Speaker, is that the airport project was going to be a better deal under a PPP than what we did. And we've debated that issue in
But
the
isn't that a matter of opinion?
Well, Mr. Speaker, but I can provide the facts. So the fact is, I can't. It's very, very simple. Because the source of funding for the airport is the same source. It's the airport tax. Under the proposal by the former government, it was going to require $60 for 30 years. Under the proposal that we have, it's $35 for 15 years. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy every single time that he brings up this and misleads us. I said it earlier today. The member continues to give half-truths. If, in fact,
Member from Microsoft, it cannot be that if somebody expresses an opinion on something, that is somehow speaking an untruth.
But he's misleading the House. He's suggesting that one is better than the other when
But that's his view. That's his view.
But Mr. Speaker, the issue was debated in this House multiple times.
But
information was provided. And now that he's in government, I would have expected he would have access to the same reports.
But Member for Castries from Mico South, the fact that something is debated and passed, that is what makes it right? You said it was debated in the House.
I said it was debated in the House and the facts were presented. If in fact the member has any information that's contrary to that, then fine. But the reality is information has been provided, detailed information, showing it's a better deal.
But member, I've sat here and I've listened to the finance minister provide his view with his facts on the alternative. So it's an opinion. Proceed, Member of Castries.
Mr. Speaker, I think I've almost said enough, but suffice it to say that when this member became Minister of Finance and Prime Minister, that everything was in place for the execution of the PPP. We shelved it and had to pay a penalty. We shelved it and had to pay a penalty. Don't be surprised. And when to borrow money, Mr. Speaker, the borrowings were done in this honorable House. We had a local consortium of banks. We had the Chinese. We had the... It was done right in this House for the airport. For the airport. Today, you are saying it's the same source of funding? It's the same source of funding. The same source of funding. We come here and borrow money for the airport, something that the PPP did not necessitate, and the ex-Minister of Finance would say is the same source of funding.
Mr. Speaker, the member from Castries Central continues to mislead. Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Point of order. What is the point of order now?
Misleading the House, Mr. Speaker. The member is misleading the House.
You misled the whole country.
Member for Castries Central, please.
The source of the borrowing was paid for by the airport tax, Mr. Speaker. Was not a burden. We increased the tax from $25 to $100, in which $35 remaining. Under the PPP proposal, the $60 would have meant that they would have absorbed the $25 going to SLASPA. But if the member wants to have a debate, another debate, and we can provide all of the details, we're happy to do that. But for the member to suggest any form of mismanagement, when the truth is that the World Bank and indigenous banks all were able to see the documents and given the verification of the viability of the airport project and proceeded to do so. And some of those financial institutions are not even here, they're regional. So there's international and also regional financing companies that saw and did their due diligence and approved of what the government was doing. And the fact is that under the PPP, it would have been $60 per passenger for 30 years. Under the proposal that we did was $35 for 15 years.
Mr. Speaker, I don't blame you. I don't blame you. He's now speaking to the repayment form of the loan. Earlier on, he spoke to the source. He spoke to the source and he said it's the same source. But now he speaks to the $35, which would contribute to the repayment. A totally different story. But, Mr. Speaker, as my colleague from Castries North said, there have been so many transgressions, misdeeds, and financial infidelities, if you want to call them that, that there can certainly be a library. But I want to let this member know that he has no authority to speak on management, no authority to speak on transparency, and no authority to speak on accountability, because he possesses none of those traits within his character. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Castries South.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I rise to lend my support to the amendment proposed by the member for Castries East and Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, after listening to the presentations by the member for Beaufort South and the member for Castries Central, there's very little one can really say to add to the debate. But, Mr. Speaker, I think there are a few things that we just probably need to examine and to really try to understand the essence of what this debate is all about. And I have tried to understand by reading the two clauses, well, one in the legislation and one in the Constitution, over and over, and try to see if I can arrive at the position that the member for Mico South had. He is arguing that the clause as stated, or the section as stated in the Finance Act, is not inconsistent with the Constitution. It does not conflict with the Constitution. Now, the member from Beaufort South and the member from Castries Central are both lawyers. And they express it, they analyze it, as lawyers would. But for me, it's a very simple logic. A very simple logic. The law says you must deliver the estimates 1 month before the end of the financial year, which means it must be tabled in this Parliament before the end of February, in very simple terms. If you don't do that, you are in violation of the law. you are in breach of the law if you don't do this. You are required, it says shall. You are required to do it before the end of February. That's what it says. The Constitution, however, which is the supreme law, says you should do so before, which can mean January, February, March, but no more than 30 days after the end of the financial year, which means no later than the end of April. But you can do it before. You can do it in January. You can do it in February. You can do it in March. You can even do it in April. The Constitution, that is the supreme law of the land, says you can go up to the end of April. The Finance Act, which was passed, says you cannot go beyond the end of February. Is there not a conflict? In a very simple, logical way, is there not a conflict? The Constitution says you can go up to the end of April. The law which was passed by the last government says you cannot go beyond the end of February. There is a conflict. When there is a conflict, which one is the right one to follow? Because the law which was passed says you cannot go beyond the end of February. How can the member from Mico South not see that there is a conflict? How can he in his mind, in his analysis, not see that there is a conflict? Now, permit me, Mr. Speaker, and if I am wrong, members who would have been in the House previously can correct me. I believe in my tenure as a parliamentarian, when this first came to the House, there were contributions expressing all the limitations of it, and a member from for Beaufort South asked that we set up a committee of the House to look at it. And that bill was withdrawn. It came back in November 2020 and was passed. No committee of the House was ever set up. So other parliamentarians on the other side never got a chance to really examine and contribute to the construction of that bill. So the government, led by the member from Mico South, went ahead and passed it. During that debate, all of us on the other side, that are now on this side, expressed our concerns with it. The member from Beaufort South, who had been a Minister of Finance, expressed his challenges that he had as a Minister of Finance and why this bill would cause difficulties and ministers of finance would run afoul of the law. He spoke about the capacity of the Ministry of Finance to be able to produce fiscal statements on time, policy statements on time. And he gave a number of experiences he had as a Minister of Finance. The member from Castries North concurred with him. And we said, even if it may be desirable, the fact is we would be unable because of the capacity deficiency that we had. It was very clear. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, even as we are meeting today to amend one clause to make it consistent with the Constitution, we need to take a holistic look at that entire bill, entire act, Mr. Speaker. We have to. Because there are certain provisions in there that will always cause problems for the Ministry of Finance and for any Minister of Finance. That is the reality. In a small island state like ours, whereas you need the discipline in fiscal management, there still has to be an understanding of our cultural context and our capabilities, and ensure we do not pass laws that we know will cause problems for us. That is the reality. The member from Mico South started his presentation and he referred to a document he said was from the IMF. Now, you know, sometimes somebody stands up and they speak and they refer to document. First page of the document, you will notice is a 2010 document, and then it says there's a disclaimer that says this is not a document of the IMF and does not reflect the views of the IMF. But he presents it to this House and says it is from the IMF, and it is what the IMF thinks and what the IMF proclaims is good practice. Simple. But that's the nature of the member from Miku South. That's the nature. And that's why when a member from Casio Central cautions and says you don't listen to any and everything he says, there is a reason for saying such, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I think we all agree in this chamber, except the two members of the opposition, that we need to ensure that our laws are in alignment with the Constitution. And if we want our laws to be in alignment with the Constitution, this amendment has to go through. I do not believe the member from Strozel Saltibus truly believes that the law is consistent with the Constitution, but that's his battle to fight on the other side, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, what is most disturbing about this debate and from the member from Miku South is his public statement on the amendments that were proposed. And he repeated it in his presentation. He spoke about the change would destroy people's trust in the financial management of this country. That it was destroying accountability and transparency. But the member is unrepentant. He never believes that he can commit a sin or has committed a sin. You would hear him a short while ago responding to the member from Casio Central about the Urunura International Airport and talk about how they were right and they presented facts. The member from Casio Central said the Urunura International Airport, the largest investment in the history of St. Lucia, did not go out to tender. If you want to talk about proper financial management, you want to talk about transparency, you want to talk about accountability, the largest project, the largest investment in this country did not go to tender. But worse than that, what the member from Casio Central did not say, it was a member from Miku South that sent a letter to the general manager of SLASPA indicating to him to choose that particular contractor to build the Urunura International Airport Terminal. And if I'm wrong, he can stand on a point of order and correct me. It was he who penned a directive or instructions to the general manager of SLASPA to award the contract to that particular company. Now, St. Lucians, Mr. Speaker, think about it. Think about it. A member who is in this House speaking about transparency, accountability, forgot, or did he really forget, that he awarded the largest infrastructural project in this country to a contractor with no tendering by the sign of a pen. Is that accountability? Is that transparency? Is that trust? Think about it, Mr. Speaker. Then he speaks about trust again and again. You know what is really painful about the Urunura International Development Project? And Mr. Speaker, there will be a debate in this House. There will be a debate. So the member from Miku South will get a chance to come here and speak. And this time, we the members who are on that side and had no information, we have all the information now. We have all the information now. And we will be the ones presenting to the people of St. Lucia. But let me give you a little trailer. Let me give you a little trailer. Let me give you a little trailer. And you heard the member from Miku South stood there a short while ago and speak about how it was the best deal. You know, They came up with a value of 175 million for the Ranuro International Airport, for which we, US, for which we took a loan, 2 loans, one from the Taiwanese and one from a consortium of banks. Do you know how they came up with $175 million? From the information I have seen. Don't go? Okay. So, from the information I have seen, somebody decided to use what I'm told is called a rough estimates. Listen to that carefully, Mr. Speaker. So they broke down the different stages of works and did rough estimates. So for example, stage 1, piling. Rough estimate, 300 piles will cost 1.9 million US. Stage 2, superstructure will cost 30 million US, blah, blah, blah. They came up with about 160 odd million. They added project management fees, whatnot, came up to 175 million. And all of that was on one page. The bill of quantities for 175 million US dollar project was on one page, three-quarter page. Three-quarter page. And you could shake your head, Mr. Speaker, as much as he wants, the documents will come to this house. They will come to this house. And Mr. Speaker, on the basis of that, they got a loan of 175 million US. 100 million US from the Taiwanese, 75 from the consortium of banks. But you know what then happens? We stood up in this house, and I remember the member from Castries is explaining that you cannot undertake such a huge project without you have detailed drawings and detailed costings. We said so. And you know, as it turns out, the stage 1, when the detailed drawings are done, moving from 1.9 million US to about 18 million US. Think about that. The stage 2 is about 45 million US estimated, more than the rough estimate. So you see the challenge we have. That the rough estimates that gave rise to 175 million US, if the trend continues that the detailed drawing showing it is a lot more, this project will cost over 300 million US. That's just a trailer of what will be contained in that debate when we come to it, Mr. Speaker. And he talks about accountability. Accountability, members of this, Mr. Speaker, that the member from Miko South has the audacity to stand in this house and speak about an amendment to make the law passed by himself, consistent with our Constitution, is undermining accountability in this country. That's just the Ranuro International Airport Redevelopment Project. And by the way, the contract with the contractors said any increase in cost that they will access, the government of St. Lucia or SLASPA will accept responsibility for it. So you're giving a contract on the basis of rough estimates, and you are saying to the contractor, any increase, we accept responsibility for it. This is the state St. Lucia is in on this project. And the debate will take place in this house, and the documents will be put on this table. And you will be judged whether there is accountability, transparency, and trust. Your betrayal of the people of St. Lucia will be placed right here. Now, you've already been judged on July 26, 2021. But there'll be a different kind of judgment coming when the people of St. Lucia really appreciate what you have done to them. Mr. Speaker, there are a few other projects, Mr. Speaker. St. Jude's, Mr. Speaker. And we come into this house again to debate St. Jude. Because when the United Workers' Party came into power in 2016, they had a technical audit. They had a financial audit. Those documents have never been tabled in this house. They have to be tabled. They have to be tabled, Mr. Speaker. And then, Mr. Speaker, we were told, and almost the entire country got consumed in a debate on whether the buildings were suitable to finish the project. They said the doorways were too small. they took a particular surrogate, and she had difficulty going through the door. I am not going to describe her any more than that. They convinced so many of their own people that the buildings were unsuitable and had to be discarded. And agreed after 3 years of stopping the project and making the people of the South suffer because there was no proper hospital for them, they started a new building with no DCA approval. And I remember I sat there and I heard the former member from Kachi South East when we chastised the approach being used by that same member from Miku South. They told us we were ignorant. We did not know about new construction techniques. That you can start putting up the frame without approval for utilities, electrical, water, whatnot, and those things can come after. So they were moving ahead with speed, and they built a huge shed along Viewfort and next to the St. Jude Hospital. And then afterwards,
Decorated the outside.
yeah, decorated the outside with a lot of panels, yellow panels like that. And Mr. Speaker, when we got into government, we're finding out that the cost of this shed is $90 million. $90 million. $90 million. There was no tendering, as far as we know, to choose a contractor to build it. $90 million. And then we're discovering a contract for $70 million to finish the ground floor, in addition to the 90.
The ground floor.
Huh? The ground floor, not the top floor. In addition.
In addition to the 90.
Right. So their plan was to finish the ground floor, put patients there, start operations, whatnot, and then go and finish the top floor on top of the people, while the patients are there. And they were the executors. They said it right there. Think about that, Mr. Speaker. $90 million was spent on that shed. And a contract, we formed a contract for another $70 million just to finish the ground floor. We have copies. If the member from Microsoft believe I am being incorrect, I'm misleading the House, he can stand and stop me.
Yeah, he should.
And you know what we discovered after all of this? We set up a team and we said to the team, we know the old buildings could be used. There was a technical audit, nobody saw it. A financial audit, nobody saw it. So we said to the technical team, go and investigate and see if it can be done. And you know what they came back and tell us? The buildings actually can be used. Nothing. Yeah, nothing. They told us the buildings can be used. So our plan is to finish the original project that he stopped. That he stopped. For 3 years, the people had no works going on in the South, saying that the buildings were not suitable, spend $90 million on building a shed, give a contract for another $70 million. Oh, they paid the consultants millions, not just one, but I think they were two other. And then now we're finding out we can actually use the original buildings for the purposes for which it was intended. Now, that's accountability. That's transparency. Is that trust? I mean, how do you sleep at night? Well, maybe you don't sleep.
And there will be no room for me.
Yeah. You know, the Rodney B. roundabout. You know, Mr. Speaker, if I start picking projects for you, Mr. Speaker, I will not go there, Mr. Speaker. I leave it for the member of Kashi's on another occasion to deal with. You know, Mr. Speaker, imagine you start a major project with no designs. No designs. And you decide you put in a roundabout here and there, and then all of a sudden it moved from there to over there. And one night I'm trying to get some help. So I'm listening intensely, and I'm finding out there's a reason why it moved from here to there, and why it did not go over there. You know, and then one of the roundabouts is placed, and sidewalks have been built, and somebody find out that no vehicles will be able to turn at the roundabout because it's too small. They have to break it down and open it up. Mr. Speaker, there was, and we're finding out now, there was never, ever any design for the road improvement. And one day in a meeting, they're discussing something to do with pipes, whatnot, and somebody had to say to them, but do you realize when you add another lane, all the pipes that were on the side is now in the middle of the road? And they said, oh gosh, we now need to order pipes from overseas. And then they realized, and Fresh Start says, but we're not paying for that because that's not in our contract. So they go to the National Economic Fund, I think, or some other place to get money. I'm not sure exactly where they got it from, to order pipes. The Roseau Dam, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, you know, Mr. Speaker, talk about accountability and transparency, and the member has the audacity to come here after 6 months of this government to say a simple amendment is destroying accountability and transparency that he built in government. Can you believe this? I can never forget the Don Lockerbie affair. I stood up in this house, Mr. Speaker, and I had the contract, and I asked to make it a document of the house. And I was told no, and the house was adjourned. And they reported me to the Speaker, say I'm tabling a fake document, and I should be disciplined as a member of this house. Well, we are in government now, and I hope the time will come when the persons who misled the last parliament as ministers will have to atone for those things, Mr. Speaker. Because I was told it was a fake document. It was. You never learn, you know. Let me tell you, the only mistake that happened in the last election was that you call it 2 weeks too early, according to the member from Castries North. Because you wouldn't be here to be saying those things, Mr. Speaker. But, Mr. Speaker, let me give you some more. We talk about, I need to keep speaking about accountability and transparency. I can never forget my first briefing as a minister when the Prime Minister, member for Castries East, gave us a statement on the state of finances of this country. And, Mr. Speaker, I've been through a lot in this politics. A lot. I've been beaten up, all kinds of things, but I sleep well at nights. I seem to have this God-given gift to sleep well. You know? But that night I could not sleep, Mr. Speaker. When the member and Prime Minister, member of Castries Prime Minister, presented his statement to us, I went home and I could not fall asleep. I could not believe that this was the state of the ship that we were going to be taking over. When I heard, Mr. Speaker, that we had payables, which are below the line, monies that government owe, that you don't really hear about, payables of about $154 million. Mr. Speaker, reflect on this. Reflect on this. These are the expenses that are not made public. Government operations require you to pay people as cash flow comes, and you manage your cash flow. I have known, certainly in my previous life, working with the Prime Minister Kenny Anthony, you might have payables of 20-something million, maybe 30-odd million. And there may be a reason, but the payables were 154 million. That this country, in addition to all the debt that we had payables of about 154 million. And we here talk about transparency and accountability. And then we heard about the direct finance contracts. And the member from Castries Central spoke about one particular contract and how somebody who got a contract, did not finish the work, was getting interest payments on the full value of the direct finance contract, even before the works were finished. But we had direct finance contracts of almost 190 million, close to that. Think about that. That contracts were given out despite the Public Management Act. Despite that, this has been touted as the Bible of accountability and transparency that we're now trying to destroy.
What you are trying to do?
That despite this document, we had direct finance contracts of almost $190 million that have to be repaid in 5 years. It is now for this Minister of Finance to find a way to pay those contracts to allow the Treasury to have some breathing space in the management of its cash flow, Mr. Speaker. And we are destroying this because we are trying to put the law in line with the Constitution. And you know why so many roads were built? To win the elections. To win the elections. Grozile got about 30 roads. 27. 27. And we all been told that once they build the roads, they win in the elections. Winning the elections. The poll said that. But I don't know if it's a greasy poll. Because $119 million to be spent on roads just to try to win an election is a cardinal sin. Did it violate this? Did it violate this? We talk about accountability and transparency. The direct contracts, Mr. Speaker. Did the direct contracts violate this? No matter what you can say about proper financial management, if the Minister of Finance, through the back door, although sometimes it's necessary, can just issue direct awards, Mr. Speaker, how can there ever be best practice? How can there ever be proper financial management? And the member from Miku South would give out direct awards like his hot bread he getting rid of, Mr. Speaker. You know, yes, you can give some. There are times you need to. But it became a practice in his government to just give direct awards. Mr. Speaker, I talk about accountability and transparency and want to accuse us of a simple alignment of the law with the Constitution as something which is so grave. Is this for real, Mr. Speaker? I heard the members speak about an independent budget office. It's actually a good idea when you think about it. In the United States, they have the budget office that will assess every budget and say what the impact it will have on the economy and on the management of the economy, whatnot. So it's not bad, Mr. Speaker. It's not bad. But there can be no independent budget office in this country if you have a prime minister like the member for Miku South. We have learned this. We go through great pains to respect professionals in this country and public servants. Doesn't mean you agree with them every time. And there are times you disagree with them, and there are times you have to engage them. But we try to respect people's professionalism because that's our nature. That's our nature. But there's no respect for the law and procedures in this country by the member from Miku South. And I think to suggest that our attempt to align the law with the Constitution as destroying accountability and transparency and the trust of the people is insulting to us. It is an insult to us. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to lend my support, and I want to call on the Prime Minister to, at the right time, set up a committee of the House where we can look at take a holistic view of this act and engage all the international organizations, all the international agencies, and ensure that we have an act that reflects our capabilities, our cultural context, and at the same time ensure that there is proper financial management. Today is a first step. We have to do it. But there's a lot more work to do, Mr. Speaker. And I hope the member from Mako South never again stand up in this house as some paragon of virtue and speak about accountability, transparency, and trust in the financial management of this country. I thank you very much.
The member of Castries Southeast. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me say good afternoon to all comrades and colleagues. This afternoon, Mr. Speaker, I think it's an opportunity and a privilege to be in this house and to speak on the matter that we have before us. In a special way, I think I'm in a parliament where I think there are about 4 prime ministers who have spoken, and I do not know if it is historical, but I think it's a moment to reflect on, and I thank God that I am present here today through the support and from the people of Castries Southeast for me to speak briefly on this amendment to the act that is before us. But grant me leave, Mr. Speaker, because importantly I would like to just mention that there is a promising young St. Lucian Coman Favre, a musician, cellist, who passed away on July 23rd this year. He was a well-loved son. He was a student at the North Park University in Chicago. I share in the pains of his family and close friends. And while the pains will not go away anytime soon, I wish to inform them that God is with them, and that just to remind them that a good life is not measured by how long we are given to be here, but by the good contributions we make during the time we are allotted. Also, Mr. Speaker, there was a young man, 27-year-old, during this week, Jamel Pierre, who passed away, and again, I want to convey my condolences to the family. Mr. Speaker, just to add my brief contribution to this debate of the amendment to the Public Finance Management Act, what is before this House is really an amendment which seeks to align or to be consistent with the specific provision of the Constitution which arrange a time for the laying of the estimates of revenues and expenditures in this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, I've listened to quite a bit of what has been said, and I really do not want to repeat anything else, but more or less to ask some fundamental questions in making my contribution based on what has been said. As we contemplated bringing this amendment to the House, I understand the Prime Minister highlighting the need for such changes for us to be consistent with the laws or the supreme law of this country. But I also understood deeper the issue of how this piece of legislation or this act affects the effective management of the business of St. Lucia. And of course, to be sure of this, I heard in the contribution from the former Prime Minister, he did indicate in his submission that he too have had difficulties with this piece, this act as it relates to the maneuverings of the business of this country. So it's important for me to ask the question, based on what has been said, what exactly is the hurt with the amendments to the Public Finance Management Act? What we're seeking to do is to cause there to be alignment in really the presentation of the estimates, the budget process, is to facilitate the budget process. This is what I've understood this to be. But I've heard the statements of
accountability, the statements of transparency, and I've asked myself, not being a constitutional lawyer or a lawyer by any stretch of imagination, nor a student of economics, but through the rudiments of what transpires through government, what exactly we are foregoing with amendments to this piece of legislation. Mr. Speaker, I've been around for some time, and I dare say there may be a time when such document was not available in the government processes, the time of sojourn. Mr. Speaker, it was during that time we spent hours and nights preparing bills of quantities to ensure that contracts were tendered. During that time when we didn't have a Public Finance Management Act in the form that it is, it was a time when professionals took a lot of time to ensure that they did things correctly. Mr. Speaker, as I am in a position to glean from the facts and evidence concerning what has obtained, I had to look again at this piece of document, and then this act, and I saw some things I need to read, especially in the preliminary section. It says, the accountable officer, and I move quickly to section 3, says, ensures that goods and services are procured from suppliers for the government only in accordance with the law for regulating public procurement. This is the Public Finance Management Act. Also, very importantly, Mr. Speaker, under Part 1 of the administration functions of the minister, it says, 1, without limiting the generality of subsection 1, the minister shall, and I move to C, manage fiscal risk, promote efficient and effective revenue and expenditure management, consider the impact of fiscal policy on current and future generations, promote transparency and accountability in fiscal policy and fiscal operations. This Public Finance Management Act doesn't cover in a special way all of the new procurement approaches that this government has embarked upon. And if you ask me what has caused hurt to the people of St. Lucia, is not this document, it is the violations of so many procurement rules, that some of which has been mentioned. And at some point in time, St. Lucians must know in its completeness what has transpired. Millions of dollars have been spent without tendering. Some of the approaches used for procuring services has not been properly advised. And it concerns me that while we speak on this, this is not the document that is affecting St. Lucians today. This is not what we're going to tell them about. We are going to tell them about some of the contractual arrangements. Mr. Speaker, just by way of example, there is a project costing $10 million approximately that was awarded to build an HRDC, Human Resource Development Center. Mr. Speaker, when I looked at the drawings, it is nothing like a Human Resource Development Center. It is an indoor facility built in the river in Bexar, the riverbed. Right there on the banks of the river. And the DCA gave 22 reasons why this project was not approved. 22 reasons outlined. But the project was awarded. And it has started. Mr. Speaker, the supplier for the steel frame could not supply the bolts because the design is faulty. And the contractor came to me asking me, can I convert or ask for the project to be converted into reinforced concrete? The design is faulty. This is $10 million, a project that cannot be cured, Mr. Speaker. This is what is affecting. This is what brings fiscal stability. This is where we are dealing with the inadequacy of resources to deal with our people. Mr. Speaker, I came up with this act, a resolution dated the 7th of December 2018. And whereas the ministers consider it necessary to guarantee a loan in the amount of $100,000 from the Export-Import Bank of the Republic of China of Taiwan of St. Lucia for the Airport Authority. And on that same day, Mr. Speaker, there was another piece of legislation where the Ministry of Finance considers necessary to borrow some of $50 million from the Export-Import Bank of China of Taiwan, $42 million to finance road improvement, $4 million to finance infrastructure and repair school, $4 million to finance the housing development program. And I'm sure the Minister for Central can recognize this piece of legislation when it came on the 7th of December 2018, when I say $4 million to finance housing development program. Mr. Speaker, that $4 million for assisting the housing situation in St. Lucia was not used for that purpose. It stayed behind. But I recall asking the questions when I was in the Senate, and I usually write at the back of this document. Will we see the day when $4 million will be spent for housing in St. Lucia? Yes, but I said it would not happen under this administration, on the previous administration. But I came here with it today because as I prepared to reflect on the changes in this document, I asked myself, how do you cure these kind of problems? How do you cure the problem of St. Jude Hospital? If we are not careful, Mr. Speaker, this thing can go unabated, and we can discuss the Public Finance Management Act on a clause that says whether we late 30 days later or 40 days later. But what is the hurt to St. Lucians? The hurt is contained in the misappropriation of funds and the reckless procurement services that has led us to where we are today. Mr. Speaker, the member for Castries South said that he couldn't sleep at a particular presentation. But what I had a problem with that presentation as well, or I reflected on it, that May, June on that presentation showed that there was a positive amount in the bank. I think it was about 40 million. But it was July that we went down with a bar below a negative amount of 150 million. And as I recall the presentation made by the Ministry of Finance, we continue to exist without showing a positive amount in the banks. What happened between July? Some of the funds I saw being borrowed, I thought, as a result of borrowing all of those funds from Taiwan and for road improvement, the funds being borrowed for the airport, I would expect to come in and see monies in the bank. But notwithstanding the funds borrowed, we still have a problem with cash flow to date. We still have issues with owing a number of DFCs. And Mr. Speaker, we need to revisit the procurement of DFCs because I see no reason why a contractor has not performed, but we are paying interest. And some of the arrangements seem as if contractors were actually benefiting from government, getting monies, and they were borrowing the same monies back to government. Because some of the contractors could not come up with a performance bond or a guarantee to get payment. In other words, they were broke while they were given the contract. But the same contractors were able in the next contract to borrow government monies. How you cannot provide a performance bond of 10% of a contract you were getting, but while you were implementing that project, you could now borrow government monies? How could that happen? Mr. Speaker, this is not captured in the Public Finance Management Act. This is where the hemorrhage, this is where we are bleeding. And this is what this Prime Minister is going to address. And this is what this cabinet is struggling with, to put things in place to avoid these things from happening ever again in St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, we probably owe, and I'm seeing some of the figures, billions of dollars. And I can almost with some level of certainty say that we cannot show value of that on the ground. That value doesn't exist. When you stop a project for 3 years, what happens? You're likely to be slapped with a claim. You understand? You stop project for a long period of time. The former administration, without paying any attention to any procurement rules, any contract administration. This is where we are hurting. This is where we are bleeding. Not here to change a date just to come and place a budget in the House of Parliament. And something tells me, Mr. Speaker, that while we speak of the IMF, the CDB, and the World Bank, I'm not an expert, but I could tell you managing small island development states is not the same like big countries. And whereas we could be very prescriptive about some things, when it matters for small island development state, we need to be careful and trust wisdom among ourselves. To not just take wholesale and say that they ask us to apply this and we're just putting that across the board. We cannot continue this way. Whereas we believe, and this Prime Minister believes in adhering to the laws of this country. He believes that we must do things right. He believes in public policy. But more importantly, we believe in putting the people of St. Lucia first. And if it's not going to work for us, we're going to come to this house and make changes. So this is not coming here to grandstand because we want to entertain a debate about this Public Finance Management Act. It is a Prime Minister who have respect for the Constitution, the same Prime Minister, notwithstanding a culture of not having a Deputy Speaker who was almost cultural and accepted, decided to go against the grain, putting a Deputy Speaker because the law demands it. Our Prime Minister do things not because it's popular, but because the law demands it. And I think if any opportunity is available for members on this side, I think the furthest we could get to perfection is to admit when we've done something wrong. I know that for a fact. When you do something wrong, you must admit that you do something wrong. And we can build this country if we admit that there was some things wrong, but not to score points or to use the opportunity of debate to take a debate where it ought not to go. This morning, I listened, Mr. Speaker, and everything that I heard, it hurt because, one, we have made it our business that everything as it relates to the people of St. Lucia is centered always in this cabinet. Our decisions, it's always because of the people. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, the decisions made earlier on and that I will not go back to, is because we thought of the people. And sometimes when we say the people, Mr. Speaker, we think of the direct beneficiaries. But indirectly, there are people who are associated with this country who want to see this country do well. And they do have a stake, they are critical stakeholders, and they do have a voice as well. So we will not come in here grandstanding, but the Prime Minister, who considers himself one who believes in consultation, who speaks with every member of this cabinet, and I'm happy to be in a cabinet where I am consulted on most, if not everything. But I'm also blessed to be among people with experience. The senior minister, the member for Central, those persons who have been in chambers before me. But I'm humbled to be here because there were 4 prime ministers here I just think the attitude towards the debate must be one that is sincere and honest. There's no need for a lot of what has been said, but to recognize that we must have laws that, or if we are enacting something, it must be consistent with the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. And of course, what is before us is to do just that. But there's no hurt, there's no provision, there's nothing in the amendment that suggests there's going to be corruption. How is that interpreted in the context of what is before us? Transparency being violated, where can that be attributed to? The changes here. Accountability, where is that? How could that be suggested in what is being suggested here? To say that we're going to bring it 40 days later, budget? I mean, anybody listening to the debate must ask what exactly is being discussed. There's nothing before us here that suggests this. If we want to discuss transparency and accountability, I think we need to go to the procurement culture of the former administration. It's laced and loaded with incidences, with situations that if and when it is placed in the public in detail, that every solution will be surprised. Don't even go there. Don't go there. You understand? When I thought St. Jude was a problem, for the little that the others have seen, I'm just saying that we have a problem on our hands. And as to how we cure some of those problems, Mr. Speaker, I think it's a major task for our administration, because we must pass laws and revisit the rules to avoid what has transpired in the past not to happen again. And if there's any sincerity on the opposition side in terms of accountability, transparency, and fiscal management, I would not speak to this piece of document. I would come with the procurement and store rules regulation that says how you award contracts and to how you do this business. Why? Because the government of St. Lucia and small island states is the largest employer, main employer of contractual services. And a large part of our capital expenditure is there. That's where the money is being spent. Roads. Not here in shifting salaries and taking monies across from the budget to do something. That's not where it is. So if we want to give donor agencies a false sense of comfort by doing these things, but then we take contracts and give to who we want, how we want, and cost overruns that they couldn't be bothered because they gave us the loan, then we are being hypocrites. We are being hypocrites. So, Mr. Speaker, while I take my seat, I really want to put this before to this House that I endorse the changes, because it's, I do not want to say immaterial, but it is to honor the Constitution first and foremost. This is what it's about. Our supreme land, our supreme law. And secondly, if we speak of transparency, accountability, it is to revisit our procurement regulations to ensure that we stop this hemorrhaging of millions and millions of dollars through contracting and the contract business that has lost total control over the last past administration. Thank you very much.
Minister for Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I want to applaud members for their contributions. Mr. Speaker, the member for Castro South left me with nothing to say. But I wanted to make the point, Mr. Speaker, that what we are doing, what we are seeking to do this afternoon is very, very simple, Mr. Speaker. Trying to align in subsidiary law to the main law. Very, very simple. And the member for Beaufort South said it clearly, Mr. Speaker. Oh, Mr. Speaker, I just want briefly to talk about that law and what is put on paper doesn't matter if the practice is not followed. If the practice is not followed, in spite of what you have on paper, does not matter, Mr. Speaker. And in the governance of the last government, regardless of the Public Finance Management Act, what they did in terms of the management of this country, if they did not have an act, I don't know what else they would have done. Mr. Speaker, the member for Microsoft quoted from the IMF, and today the IMF has become a source of reference, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the IMF recommended to the government not to reduce VAT. They did it. The IMF recommended to the government not to borrow for the airport, but do it for PPP. They did it. The IMF advised the government to procure by tendering, not by direct award. They did it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to say today in this honorable house that our government has committed itself to fiscal responsibility and to macroeconomic stability. We have committed ourselves to that, Mr. Speaker, and all our actions for the last 6 months will show that we have committed ourselves to that, Mr. Speaker. What we've said is that people cannot be left to suffer whilst you look at ratios whilst people are suffering. We will not allow people to suffer just to maintain ratios, Mr. Speaker. We will strike a balance between the ratios and to allow a better life for the people of the nation, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we just want to say that when we must put things in context, Mr. Speaker, the member from Microsoft speaks about Grenada, and he says Grenada is the best practice because Grenada has laws, Mr. Speaker. Of course, but again, you must take it in context. How did Grenada get to where it got? Grenada got to where it got before COVID for a rigid structural adjustment program. A rigid structural adjustment program that not only increased taxes, but created an environment where, because of the medicine that they took, the Grenadian economy happened to stabilize itself, Mr. Speaker. But what the Grenada government inherited when it got into power was nothing like what this government inherited when they got into power in 2016. And you can make the comparisons, Mr. Speaker. When this government got into power in 2016, they found an economy that was on the cusp of beginning to improve. They found an economy with projects, an airport, 2 hospitals, the Grozile Highway, an administrative center in Viewfort, funding for 15 feeder roads, funding for the Millennium Highway, Mr. Speaker. They found these projects ready to go. They abandoned all of them, Mr. Speaker. Every one of them was abandoned, and that caused the country to either stop or go back. So when COVID hit, St. Lucia was found in a situation where it suffered the most from COVID, a 26% decrease in GDP because of COVID, the 6th largest decline in the world. You know why? Because the government had stopped the projects that would have created some level of economic viability and economic growth and went on a frolic of their own. That is the situation. That's a different solution, Grenada. So Grenada could sustain it because Grenada did not go on this lavishness and this recklessness, but instead they took to a strict level of structural reform and macroeconomic changes. Barbados, Mr. Speaker. When the Barbados government came into power, they found a debt to GDP ratio of over 150%. In St. Lucia, when they got into power in 2016, they found a debt to GDP ratio of about 65%. What they should have done, Mr. Speaker, is to build on what they found. And no Public Finance Management Act cannot help you when you have these bad practices, Mr. Speaker. No act can help you, Mr. Speaker. Why are we in that state? Why? Why are we in that state, Mr. Speaker? And the member for Cash Resolve was right. We're in that state, Mr. Speaker, because in spite of the Public Finance Management Act, this government found a hospital being built. They paid for technical audits. They refused to make the technical audit public. You know why? Because the technical audit said that these buildings could continue to be used as a hospital with some slight modification. That's what the audit said. So they refused to put it in public. But then the member for Miko South speaks about a letter that said it would take $100 million to complete it. But Mr. Speaker, that letter is a letter on our program. Because they have spent, and they've been itching us, they've been pushing us. Say what you find, say what you find, say what you find. As they say in patois, point du vent à point du vent point. They have been itching us in the St. Jude, Mr. Speaker. If they had spent that $100 million to complete the St. Jude, and that's not true, but if they had spent it, Mr. Speaker, the money that they have spent on the car park they have built, and the money that they intend to spend based on a contract that we saw. And when the time comes, we'll make it a document of the House for everybody to see, Mr. Speaker. We will put it in the public domain because we are tired of people hiding behind flashing mirrors. We're tired of that, Mr. Speaker. You will find that they needed $70 million plus what they've spent already on the car park, which is more than $50 million to complete the bottom floor of St. Jude Hospital without one piece of equipment. So it's better they had spent the $100 million on the St. Jude buildings. They would have saved. But Mr. Speaker, no public finance manager can help you when you behave in that kind of way, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, roads. There was a poll done in this country, and we did it too, which said that if you build roads, you'll win elections. If you build roads, you'll win elections. So this government, after they had borrowed from the Taiwanese over $200 million to build roads, saying that they would pay it off the fuel surcharge, they went on a frolic again and gave direct awards for $186 million worth of roads at 5%. You know what that's costing us, Mr. Speaker? You know what this costs me as Minister of Finance on behalf of the taxpayers of St. Lucia? $46 million in payments. $46 million in this fiscal year. Whereas if the government had just followed what the Kuwaitis had left for us, we would have got $110 million worth of loans with a 5-year grace period to pay back in 20 years. Listen, and we talk about accountability because of an act. And you know, when we quote the IMF and the World Bank, I'm not against these institutions, but these institutions must begin to speak the truth of what they find and why the ratios are where they are today. Because that $46 million that I have to find to pay, Mr. Speaker, if this government had just went through the process and looked for infrastructural loans, as most governments are doing, look for loans for infrastructure. These are structured loans that you pay over 20 years. But to do them, you have to have an internal rate of return. You have to look at the economic feasibility of these roads. But in their mind, it was not the economic feasibility, it was the political probability. Not the economic feasibility. Not whether the roads had an IRR that justified them being built. Not the process that we went through when we were doing the Kuwaiti roads, and which we are going to start back. The minister, senior minister, has been has agreed that we are going to begin to look at the a proper feasibility for the reconstruction of roads in St. Lucia. Roads that have an economic rate of return, roads that will bring some level of economic viability to the country. And in the QAT package, Mr. Speaker, they will feed the roads into the agricultural areas, into the areas of production in this country, not roads to nowhere for political benefit, Mr. Speaker. And that is why we are here today. So no public finance act can help us. These things are just things that you have because some people say you must do it. The proof of the pudding, Mr. Speaker, is how you use the resources of the country, and if you have the diligence not to be swayed by political situations only. And, Mr. Speaker, if you have the sustenance and the fortitude to say people, you must do what is right. So even though you are my friend, Mr. Speaker, I will say to you, I cannot give you $20 million to build half a mile of road. I can't tell you that, Mr. Speaker. And many times, Mr. Speaker, many times, people come to us. People say that the Labour Party government doesn't see about its own. You know why they say that, Mr. Speaker? Because we demand that things are done right, Mr. Speaker. So, we are building the custody suites. The custody suites, when you hear about COVID, and I want to get back because I'm relating that, Mr. Speaker, to the acts. The custody suites. You heard about we were weak, we did not arrest people for wearing masks, and they gave the minister, and I wanted to seek a little bit to see how this government has handled, the cabinet it may have, how we've handled this COVID crisis in a very professional and a systematic way, Mr. Speaker. So what have we done? We are going to build but you know what? We have instructed the minister to tender. So in spite of the need for the custody suites, there's going to be a tender process and an eligible contractor will be given the job to the custody suites, even though we need it, Mr. Speaker, and even though we intend to do it by design finance contract. So Mr. Speaker, I am all for maintaining the law. My father was a policeman. I brought up in law. I brought up understanding right and wrong. I brought up understanding that I must do certain things in a certain way. That's why I have no problems with discipline. That's why I could wait. I could wait my turn. That's why I could wait. That's why I could understand that to lead you must follow. That's why I understand them, Mr. Speaker. I understand these things. That's what I am of. That's what I am of. I understand following, I understand discipline, I understand principle, Mr. Speaker. So, when we find ourselves in these situations and people want you to believe that what you have to do is a show. So you must pretend that you are following, that we are breaking the law. We're not breaking any law. We are aligning the law to the Constitution. So to appear that we are creating a cardinal sin and we are villains because we are saying that the Constitution must be aligned to the subsidiary law which the Finance Management Act, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we do not need a lesson in transparency and a lesson in accountability, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have not taken any decisions without consulting with the technocrats. If it's health, we consult with the health officials, Mr. Speaker. Even in law and order, we do not interfere with the runnings of the police force, much to our detriment. I say it loud, Mr. Speaker, because certain things that we could have done, we have not done, because our hands have been tied by the strictures of the system. But we follow. We are patient because we understand the value of following the Constitution and following the law, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we can quote from all books and all documents that make us sound nice, Mr. Speaker. But the proof of the eating is in the pudding, Mr. Speaker. Is how you run the government. How when you have the opportunity to follow best practice, you do not follow best practice, Mr. Speaker. And if best practice is followed, this economy of St. Lucia would never be in the mess that it is today. I would have never had inherited what I hate to use that word. I would have never have found what I found on the 27th of July if best practice was followed and if this government had done what it had to do at the time, Mr. Speaker. Several situations where we wasted money. Several situations where we had to make a point, to make us cry, to make us pay. Decisions were taken only with the political motive. How you will make the Labour Party look bad. So you stop meaningful projects, Mr. Speaker. No one can tell me up to today, no one could tell me any reasonable reason why Hiwano International Airport was stopped. There is no one who can tell me why, Mr. Speaker. There is no rational, no economic reason when the IMF that you quote said that we should follow the PPP model. No one can tell me, Mr. Speaker. And when the story, and the Mayor for Castries South began it, when the story of Hiwano International Airport is told, you will see that no public finance management act can help you. Can help us. That was no help to us. If that was help to us, we would not have been in the mess we're in with the Hiwano International Airport. What? Slasper. So, Mr. Speaker, I obey the law. We are all for fiscal rules, we are all for stability. We are going to follow the law. We're going to follow the processes. But what will define our government is in the practice of governance. That is what's going to define us. How we behave, how we ensure that we follow the rules, Mr. Speaker. That is what is going to define us. And it's only 6 months, Mr. Speaker. But I say to you, it's 6 months since this government, we have taken over the administration of this country, Mr. Speaker. And no one can say that during these 6 months, we did not try or we did not follow best practice, Mr. Speaker. Best practice from even the Deputy Speaker. Best practice, simple things, very simple things. We caused the youngest member in the parliament. And I wasn't the most popular person for that. I know that. But I stood by the principle that if for 5 years we had spoken about not having a deputy speaker, we could not come into government and not appoint a deputy speaker. And I'm sure when the time comes, the history books will reflect that I followed the law and the constitution of the country, and I was not convenient, Mr. Speaker. And that is how I intend to run the government of St. Lucia. I intend to run it not for convenience, but with principle. I intend to run it, Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of the majority of people of this country, and not for the benefit of a few. I intend to run it where everyone will have an opportunity to aspire to become something better in this country. That's how I intend to run it, Mr. Speaker. I intend to use the meager resources of this country to improve people's lives, even though it means sometimes stretching the ratios. Even though it means that, Mr. Speaker, even though it means having to deal with the international financial institutions that will put some pressure on us, Mr. Speaker. We will not be reckless. We will not disobey. We will see if we can stay within the fiscal barometers that are placed for us. But I will never make the people suffer because for the benefit of a few, Mr. Speaker. This is why we are going to finish St. Jude Hospital for the people of this country. We are going to finish St. Jude Hospital, Mr. Speaker. And we are going to ensure that what is happening at Hiwanora International Airport is brought to some level of fiscal discipline and fiscal responsibility. It can't continue. So in spite of that, in spite of the quotations, Mr. Speaker, in our practice, Mr. Speaker, we will ensure that our practices are right, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, what is irrational? And the Minister of Education, he can tell you, we were buying computers. I instructed that you have to go to tender. Even though the computers would arrive a few weeks late, we will explain to the people of the country, but we will not do like Fortuna picks. Direct award. And Mr. Speaker, our information tells us that officials of the Ministry of Education advised the government that that was not the right way to go. And today, these computers or these e-books are a burden for the people of St. Lucia instead of a help, Mr. Speaker. And we have, after we've bought them, we now have to pay licenses for them every year after we've bought the e-books, Mr. Speaker. It's cost us millions of dollars every year. What can that do for you with that kind of practice? What can laws in a book do for you with that kind of practice? Up to today, we have to pay millions of dollars for licenses where you could get laptops or you could get tablets and you would get the same thing done at a cheaper rate. But we're going to solve it because the tenders have been chosen, and then we are going to get 10,000 laptops or tablets for the children of the people of St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you speak about, when we talk about good governance, and because we are aligning a law to the Constitution, we're committing a cardinal sin, and all kind of quotations that come from everywhere, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, good governance doesn't mean that what you say or what you quote. Good governance means how you deliver and what you deliver and the way in which you deliver it, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. We have found ourselves in a situation where we've inherited an economy that is in 26% decline. COVID affected the entire world. So I'll never blame any government for COVID. COVID affected the entire world, Mr. Speaker. But the money we borrowed was not money given to St. Lucia because St. Lucia was special, or because St. Lucia had that act, or St. Lucia did not intend. The money was given to the entire world. The whole world borrowed money, was given at concessionary rates because of COVID. The whole world, everybody. Barbados, St. Vincent, everybody was given money. We weren't so special, that's why we got money. But what did we do with the money? Out of the $229 million that we borrowed, Mr. Speaker, all but 10% of it had to go into recurrent expenditure because when COVID struck, our economy was in a state of confusion and in a state of decline. We had no reserves to meet our current expenditure, so we had to use all that money to pay salaries and to keep the government coffers running, where other countries who had reserves could have used part of their reserves to pay salaries, etc. That is why we are in the state that we are today. And you talk about management, and you talk about quoting from the IMF and saying, And before I end, Mr. Speaker, because you know, when I get in this topic, I can speak for the whole night. Because it's hurtful, Mr. Speaker. But when I go to my constituency, and I see the guys there complaining, boss man, nothing here running, nothing here running, nothing here running, and they put pressure on me, boss, you are the prime minister, you know, and you can't give me nothing, Mr. Speaker. And I see how much money we owe, how much the CDP owes for contracts. How much the CDP owes for contracts, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, you see that whole CDP? That's a whole different story, Mr. Speaker. That deserves a study on its own. When you look at the amount of money that went from projects called Synergy, absolutely no accountability. No accountability. And today, we have a debt of $200 and something thousand to pay people who worked with Synergy. We owe $4 million plus for CDB contracts. A lot of them went in the month of July, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and the Minister for Equity has to account to the cabinet, because in 1 month, 650, in 10 days, $650,000 were spent at the SSDF in one constituency.
That's accountability and transparency.
That, and no book I help you.
And that book was
no book, and that book was working in already. You had that book, and we hadn't changed the laws yet. $650,000 in 10 days in one constituency, and these 10 days were between the 10th of July and the 25th of July.
And they still lost it.
Mr. Speaker, no laws can help you, Mr. Speaker. When you send an agreement with a contractor for $75 million on the 15th of July. On the 15th of July, a contract is sent to be signed for $75 million on the 15th of July. But the civil servant, in his wisdom, he say that one a little too hot. So he pass it. If that civil servant didn't act with such competence, we would have on our hands a contract signed for $75 million for completion of the bottom floor of St. Jude. How is it possible for you to complete the bottom floor of the hospital and leave the top floor people working on it? I mean, does that make any sense? I mean, is it logical, even though you have that book? Is it logical to spend over $150 million on the bottom floor of the hospital, and you say that you will move it with the bottom floor, whereas you will work on the top floor? And all of us say, if you're renovating your home you're renovating, sometimes you have to leave to renovate your house. But you could build a whole house. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to tell the people of St. Lucia that they must have some patience with this government, Mr. Speaker. Because we have not gone around and cried and blamed people. We have gone around purposefully doing what we have to do for the benefit of the people of this country, Mr. Speaker. And we have not gone on any witch hunt. Because if you're going on a witch hunt, we'll have so many witches we're going to hunt. We could go on a witch hunt. We could come and show documents, and although they hid some of it, we could if you are vindictive government, Mr. Speaker, if you are vindictive, if you're a government that was going after people, look at how we've treated the civil service, Mr. Speaker. Look at how we treated, and look at this the United Party record for the first 6 months of office, and look at what they did in the civil service, what they did in the foreign embassies. You saw the difference between them and us. That's the difference, Mr. Speaker. Between them, look at it. Keep your memory short. Look at what you did in your first 6 months in terms of how you treated civil servants, how you treated ambassadors, what you did in the police force in the first 6 months of your rule, and look at what we did in our first 6 months. And you see the difference, Mr. Speaker. So in spite of the fact that when we try to change laws to align with the Constitution, you accuse us of all kinds of things. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, Mr. Speaker. That's what it is. Look at the civil service. Ask the permanent secretaries. Ask them. Ask them how ministers treat them with respect. Look at it. Ask the permanent secretaries the respect that are given by ministers. Ask them. Ask them how we ensure that good governance is practiced. Look around. Look around, you see, Mr. Speaker. Look around. But that comes at a cost. At a cost that some of our supporters are annoyed at us. They believe that we are going too slow. They believe that we are not doing what we're supposed to do, because they know that they suffered immensely when we were not in government, Mr. Speaker. They know they suffered. They suffered, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank members for supporting this bill, and I want to say to them, Mr. Speaker, that the motive of this government, Mr. Speaker, you speak about transparency and accountability. Look at that. One direct award, Mr. Speaker, one of them, $2.093 million for one company. Supervision services, Mr. Speaker, for Bexar Community Center. That's what he was talking about. $904 million. And you heard what the minister said? The center was in the river.